Okay, we call to order this special meeting of the combined. Everybody, please turn your microphones off if you're not speaking. That's the feedback. This special combined meeting of the PAC and TAC at 4 o'clock, even though daylight savings wasn't acknowledged by the system up there. It is 4:01 right now. So let's begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join me, follow me in pledging allegiance to our flag and the republic which it represents. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We'll take roll of the combined committee. TAC Chair Adam Bingham will take the TAC roll first, and then Josh will take the PAC roll.
Thank you, Dave. All right, Eddie Teasdale.
He's here.
Tim Parker. Here. Don Decker.
Here.
Don Quist.
Here.
Earl Wilson.
Here.
Mallory Boyd.
Present.
Myself, Adam Bingham, here. Stephen Bork.
Here for now.
For now. Michelle Anderson is not here this evening. Wade Major.
Here.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn that back over to you, Dave.
Okay, go ahead, Josh.
Okay, Ed Imson.
Present.
Tim Carroll.
Present.
Judy Decker. Here. Camille Anderson. Here. Renee Westerlusk. Here. Patricia Quist, I believe, is not here
Pat
today.
is just had hip surgery. She has a call-in number. If she's able to call in, she will not be able to vote, but we do not have a voting item on the agenda. So we'll wait. Pat, have you called in? If she calls in, she'll be allowed to come in at the appropriate time.
All right, David Janik.
Present.
Joshua Nugent here. Nick Panzer.
Present.
Lyle Fisher.
Here.
Wes Kassenstein. Here. Don Zadiba. Here. John Kersey.
Here.
And last but never least, Lorelei Oviatt.
Here. Last but never least. Good, Josh. Okay, this is, as we said, a special combined meeting that provides some logistical challenges that you'll obviously see in the audience and among the committee members. I'll explain a little bit how we're going to conduct this meeting in order to maximize the time, effectiveness, and efficiency. We're going to have the agenda per se, and I'll explain this before we start the public comments. It's a co-chaired meeting, myself, PAC Chair Dave Janis, and TAC Chair Adam Bingham. We are going to conduct the meeting jointly. I'm going to conduct some of the joint portion of it because I was able to be present when you weren't at the planning conference, but we're all briefed up on this. We began the planning for this before it was announced that it had to be a combined meeting, and the reason that it's combined is that we had to have access to both the engineering team, Stetson Engineers, the Water Resource Manager, and the Groundwater Authority Special Counsel, Jim Markman, who are both present down in the front. And they were not able to make, there was no time. We were able to cover 2 individual meetings and do that. Plus there's the consideration additionally of hearing consistency in the whole thing. But the objective for this meeting, and it's a single objective, special combined committee meetings, both the PAC and the TAC have quorums from the roll, to allow the Groundwater Authority Water Resource Manager and his technical team and the GA Special Counsel to present and address the draft GSP that was released to the committees late Monday night and went out to the public Tuesday. In so doing, the purpose of the meeting is for us to, the committee members and the public, primarily the committee members, we haven't had time to go through such a lengthy document in detail, although we've had parts of it before, but to generate our questions and clarifications required so that we can submit cogent, coherent, hopefully, and complete questions individually per the process established by the 15th of November. So individual members of each committee, PAC and TAC, will submit their individual comments to Stetson and to the respective chairman of their panel by noon, 12 noon, on the 15th. We will consolidate them, get them all together, ensure that Stetson did in fact receive all of them, ensure that the Groundwater Authority did receive them, and they will be posted in their entirety on the website so the other committee members of both committees and the public, of course, can see them. So the main objective of this meeting, although people are welcome to make comments, the main objective is for us to understand more fully what it says, clarify any issues and questions we have, and write our individual informed opinions that will go out back to the GA represented by Stetson, the Water Resource Manager, to be included in an update that they will then, they will take public comments and make their next draft, which will be released publicly per the schedule on the 2nd of December. Correct, Steve?
That's correct.
Right. And that one will form the basis for a tentative public evening workshop, which would likely be, and the staff has to come up with a recommended date, sometime the week of the 9th of December. And the official 45-day notice hearing date for the full acceptance and review by the GA, voting on the ordinance, would be on the 19th of December. Is that, I'm sorry, the January meeting. I don't remember what the date is on that meeting. It'd be the third Thursday, 16th of January.
Regular board meeting.
So that's the timeline. So the public can submit comments out of what they've seen posted and any clarifications they receive today. They're invited, obviously, to input by the 15th, but certainly it's a requirement for we as members of the TAC and PAC to do that, again, so that we have completeness and clarity. Each committee send it to your respective committee chair by noon on the 15th. So what we will do, we'll go from here into the public comments, item number 2 on our agenda, which is for the public to make comments on those things that are not on our agenda today, and we only have one item on the agenda, and they must be under our purview. So are there any open public comments at this time? Seeing none, we'll move to item number 3, which is the main purpose of this presentation. While I mentioned the draft GSP itself in its entirety was posted on the website on Tuesday, available to the members of the committees late Monday night. There is also a presentation that became available this morning that all members were forwarded. It's out on the tables in front. We'll be projecting it, I believe, behind us, that are going to be given by the Water Resource Manager, Steve Johnson, and the Groundwater Authority Special Counsel for Water, Jim Markman. So with that, that's item number 3. We'll start into that. The process after that is all members make notes on questions and clarifications you have as we go through these slides. When we come to the end of the slides, we'll open it up. Adam will take over the chair for coordinating TAC, technical comments, questions, clarifications. When that's complete, we'll do the policy, comments, questions, clarifications, that I will coordinate that portion of it. We may have a wrap-up for the committees, and then we'll, if there were questions, additional questions that arose from that, and then we will open it up for public comment on the GSP and clarifications and questions. So that's the process we're going to go through. We're going to try to follow, when we get to the public, it is as it would have been, or as it states for the open public comments, 3-minute limit for individuals. If we get through all of them, we may have an opportunity to have somebody come up again. but we're trying to make this meeting as efficient and effective as we can. And again, the idea is that we exhaust as many of the questions and clarifications needed so that we can develop our thoughts to submit our comments on this in the Stetson and the chairs by the 15th. So with that, over to you, Steve.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Adam, too, the two chairs of the two committees. First, I want to welcome everybody. This date and this actual opportunity to walk through a draft GSP has been on the schedule, and I know everybody's been looking at this for a long time. And if you wait long enough, it finally shows up. When we're here and we're ready to walk through a draft of the GSP. Jeff is actually going to walk through the detailed portion of the draft. As David mentioned, we do have a schedule that we're trying to follow to pull all of this together to get out in public review and walk through everything. There is a slide for that, so you'll be able to take that with you. You don't have to remember all of that. We'll walk through that too, also separately. As we welcome you all to this little presentation of the PAC and the TAC, I just want to take 1 second and recognize all of the participation from the folks in the PAC and the TAC. I mean, we really have a extreme, I mean, from my experience of a lot of years in the water industry, we have an extremely qualified group of people that are volunteering their time to work on this stuff. With the PAC and the TAC, we also have a tremendous amount of information and talent and intelligence and local knowledge participating in the audience. So it's very unusual to have this much involvement, and we honestly, we do appreciate it, and we're trying to take it all in, but there is a lot of information, a lot of good people involved, and we appreciate that. So the idea of the combined meeting, PAC and TAC, I think David explained it pretty well. If it doesn't go well, I'll take responsibility because I kind of thought it was a good idea, but it kind of went south in a couple of emails I saw, but that's fine. Hopefully it'll go well. And primarily, as David explained, but I'm going to mention it to you folks too, one of my thoughts was that we were trying not to walk through the exact same presentation twice, because it's fairly long, within 2-3 hours of each other. With a lot of the same people, that it might be better to do it once. That was the idea. Understand the coordination, and hopefully we'll make this work. We're going to work real hard to make this work so everybody's comfortable and everybody gets what information they need and has an opportunity to comment or ask questions. So today, I'm here, Steve Johnson, with Stetson Engineers, the Water Resource Manager with the team. I've got Jeff Helsley here. Jeff's sort of our engineering manager. You guys have seen Jeff at pretty much all of the meetings, and he's kind of managing the day-to-day work. Special Counsel Jim Markman's here. I think it's a really good opportunity to have us here working on the technical stuff and Jim at the same time. We've been working very closely with Jim on the Special Counsel water allocation rights component, and I mean, he's here. He'll answer any question you guys have. Any question, hopefully. I'm putting you out there, but any questions you have on the water rights allocation, we've talked a lot about it, but it's a very good opportunity. I want to also emphasize and recognize that you folks at the PAC, we don't mean to have neglected you, but we haven't been before you guys very much. So this is a good opportunity to kind of pull it back together. We recognize that there's been a lot of interest in having more technical folks and more legal folks at your PAC meetings. So that at least that'll work better. One other thing I wanted to do, if the camera's out there, I wanted to say hi to Heather because I know she's watching. Heather's been sick, and she has been a trooper trying to pull this together. I mean, frankly, some people have called me and asked me questions over the last 4 or 5 days, and I said, I don't know what she's doing. I don't even go in there because if I do, it's not good because she's working on this thing, and she wants me to just leave her alone and let her get it done. So Heather, thank you if she's out there. I know she's going to watch and see what's going on, but Heather had a real large role in pulling all this together. The other thing I wanted to mention, and Josh is up there, but at the last board meeting, Josh was a guy that stepped up and said, we need to have technical people and we need to have legal counsel, special counsel at this meeting, and if need be, we'll help fund that. So folks who didn't know that, Josh did that, so I want to make sure people understand that.
And we did include $5,000 extra on our last pump fee, so we do appreciate you guys being here a lot. So thank you.
Yep. I'll try not to order a big dinner tonight, just something small. But thank you, Josh. I just want to make sure people are aware that they did step up and do that, because I know all of you folks that have been coming to these meetings, and most all of you folks are the same people, know that there are cash flow, financial issues going on with the authority, and we're trying to work on those. And Don's working very hard on that stuff. So, moving down, we do have a lot to cover tonight. I hope it's helpful. Once we get into the review of the sections, we want to kind of keep it rolling, as David mentioned. We want to kind of keep it rolling and let Jeff get through it, and then work with the PAC and the TAC on questions, and then, because a lot of the questions they ask may be the same ones you folks want to ask, and then go out to the public and see what we've got, and then double back. But so that's the process we're going to try and follow. I think David explained it very well. I'm not, other than this thing at the front, I'm not going to do that much talking. I'm going to let you know, because you guys have the handout, that we're going to do the overview. The overview, Jim Markman's going to do it. We work with Jim on this little PowerPoint, but Jim can do this in the dark and with no notes at all. Just to talk, just to talk a little about SGMA, how it works, what the process is, and maybe a little bit of discussion either now or with questions about water allocations under SGMA, water rights under the state of California, because there's still a lot of questions out there, and if you ask attorneys, you're going to get 3 or 4 different answers. But I think, in my opinion, Jim's right, so we're going to hear from Jim. I mentioned the schedule. We also have a schedule we're going to walk through. We'll probably do that after Jim does his overview, and then we'll do the GSP summary, and Jeff's going to do that. So with that, I think we're going to have Jim come up and just quickly, and I'll change this to
the next one.
There you go.
Okay, happy to be here. Whoever suggested I come up, I am very happy to be here. And it just so happens that right now, in the last 2 weeks, I've been putting together essentially a seminar, 4.5-hour seminar on water rights, which concludes with SGMA as the last part of it, for 35 lawyers in my firm who want to learn something about this stuff and haven't done it before. So I've had the opportunity in the last month or so to revisit and reread virtually every case that's going to generate a water right priority opinion, whichever way it goes. And I'm also well aware of the fact that my advantage is I don't represent any producer. All I represent is getting through the process on behalf of the agency itself, and getting through whatever process follows, DWR, litigation, no litigation, and try to generate a defensible plan, particularly when it comes to water allocation, water pumping allocations. And everyone who has a major allocation here is represented by a very good lawyer who I've known the least amount of time, at least 20 years, and I respect them all. But they're advocates, so I don't have to be an advocate for any particular person. So that can be helpful or not. So we're going to run through SGMA and some of these concepts. So, we used to refer to groundwater allocations as the Wild West because there has never been until 2014 any state administrative regulatory process for registering, having awarded water rights, the priority of water rights. It all started to sort of come together in the early 40s with the case Pasadena versus Alhambra, but it's up till 2014 in SGMA, the whole thing's been driven by 2 things. One is groundwater adjudication's evolution, which got pretty hot and heavy from about 1969 up to 2000, well, up to even now with the Antelope Valley case. And the other is special legislation, which has given groundwater management regulation authority to certain public entities, like the Orange County Water District, for example, manages the Orange County Water Basin based on statutory authority. And those are exempt from SGMA, those that are managed that way. But we did get SGMA in 2014. It was a package of legislation, 3 different bills. One of the things it said that's kind of significant is that if you're going to have an allocation based on a water right, you can't work into that water production after January 1, 2015, so people couldn't rush out and say, here comes this legislation, I'm going to increase my pumping and make a claim to a greater allocation. So that was a wise thing to do. So the key principle of SGMA at the bottom of this slide is to have groundwater managed at the local level or regional, but really the local level rather than having the state engraft management plans on various basins. And so it gives you an opportunity to do that. It gives you a timeline within which to do it. And if you don't, the state will put you on probation. And if you still don't, after the probationary period ends, theoretically, the Department of Water Resources will come down and do it for you, enforce it on all the local officials and on the local water producers. So it's an opportunity at a local level to solve problems. And all these basins are now coming to the point, the really stressed basins are coming to the point where water allocations have, at least the theory behind them, are going to become known at the end of next January. And I can tell you there's already significant litigation in Las Posas Basin about these issues, and so it's not going to surprise anybody if what really happens from SGMA is it forces a whole lot of adjudications very quickly. So SGMA defines sustainable groundwater management as managing and using groundwater in a way it can be maintained through implementation horizons without the magic phrase always found in every case, without causing undesirable results. And then SGMA defines undesirable results, but some of the definitions aren't very clear. Seawater intrusion is an undesirable result. That's clear. Subsidence, that's clear. That's another one. Degradation of groundwater quality is another one. But then you get into things that are a little more elusive, such as, and I don't mean permanent or chronic overdraft. That's pretty obvious too. But then you get into the question of overdrafting or mining too much water in storage so that becomes an undesirable result. But what is that? What is that amount? It's going to depend on the totality of the circumstances. And engrafted on all this is California law and the reasonable use doctrine. So you have, on the one hand, priority totem poles of water right priorities, which we can figure, and they're certain, and you can plan around them. And then if you graft on that the question of whether a particular use of water is reasonable under all the circumstances, particularly in a basin like this basin, then it becomes uncertain. So we're dealing with all of those issues and factors, and we've received input on both sides of those from citizens and very capable lawyers. So next slide. We've talked about local agencies established the GSA, which has been done here. The usual gripe about GSAs everywhere is that only public entities maybe have voting representation on them. So the other water production and land use interests in a community can't vote. They can, this agency's attempted to take input from the entire community, but only these public entities have a vote. And the public entities either regulate or sell or distribute water, or they have land use authority. Those are the two kinds that can be on a SGMA board. And so that's what you have here. And it creates, in my view, and I'm working on about 4 of these, that decision, I don't know what else they would have done, but it creates distrust. It's very easy to distrust a board where you're a large or small agricultural producer, and you know that whatever you say, the only people voting in the end to send a plan up to be reviewed by DWR represent public entities. And there's been some filings in that Las Posas case that are pretty colorful when they start describing the built-in conflicts of interest that everybody but the public entities are pointing out. So that's just human nature, I think, to distrust a process that you can work hard at, but you don't get to vote in the end. And even inside the board, where you have different public entities, they have different attitudes too. But basically, municipal industrial use is the only use represented in this process in a voting role. So that's just a fact of life, the way they set it up. So DWR has designated, my recollection is 515 groundwater basins, distinct groundwater basins in Bulletin 118, published years and years ago. They've developed guidance documents and they provide technical and planning assistance. I don't know how much assistance. And then in the end, they have to evaluate these plans, implementation plans that are submitted to them. And they're going to be about 100. So there's 2 levels of plans that are submitted and 2 dates for submission. The first date is the end of January. That is for basins that, based on monitoring for a period of time, are the most stressed basins in California. So the ones that are having the most severe, relatively severe overdraft, mining of the basin, present all the worst problems. And Indian Wells Valley Basin is on that list, so the plan is due for review. There's going to be over 100 of these due for review by DWR around February 1, and one of the questions we all ask is how are they going to do it, who's going to do it for them. They don't have that kind of staff. Are they going to contract that out to engineering firms? We're not sure how they're going to fund it. But anyway, that's where you are. So you're in the first tier of most stressed basins, and you have the tightest timeline because of that. And as I said before, if you don't get it done on time or you don't get it done right, someone will tell you what was wrong with it. You'll be put on probation. You fix it. If you don't fix it, then supposedly the state will take over the process and develop a plan and enforce it on you. So talked about, you can go to the next slide, Steve, or maybe the one after that. So basically, the monitoring under CASGEM is pretty much the tool that was used by DWR to determine which are the most stressed basins. So we know, we all have heard here, and I think fundamentally agree that there's about 4 times the production, 3 to 4 times the production in this basin that would be essentially non-mining or within any kind of natural safe yield. So that's a pretty stressed basin, and so that's where we are on that. So here's an organizational chart. Go to the next one, Steve. Here's an organizational chart of what you have already done and accomplished, which isn't that easy. There's a lot of areas where they're not having an easy time with this, and that is that you've got all of these interested parties you see at the top of the list, 5 of which are voting parties because they represent the 5 in the middle. The 2 at the end are advisory but don't have votes. That's the Navy and BLM. So you have 3 counties. The local water district, which is the large retail supplier, public entity supplier, the only public entity supplier in town, and the city of Ridgecrest. So there are your voting members. And there's an organizational chart. Under that, you will see general manager, legal counsel to the agency. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. Not legal counsel for any producer. And so forth. So you've got on the one side the technical engineering people, the policy advisory committees, technical committee, and so forth. So that's what was created here, and there were an implementation of fees geared toward pumping fees so that the plan can be developed and submitted. And after that, if it, assuming we get to the point that it's approved, finally approved, or finally agreed to by everybody concerned, then there are also fees that can be levied to go ahead and put it into effect. So the next one, so the definition of my role is up there on the top, and it's important for me to say this. I have to advise the board on water law, water rights, and groundwater adjudication. I've also tried to, I won't say mediate, but be involved in the discussions, trying to find a way to get all the impacted producers in the basin to agree on some approach that would satisfy their needs. And of course, it's hard to satisfy needs when you get to produce 1/4 of the water that's presently being produced in order to get a viable plan. So that's what we've tried to do. So I want to say I will answer as honestly as I can water law, water right questions that come up today if people have them. But nobody should take that as, well, here's a final opinion on that question, because we don't have all the facts or circumstances in front of me, and I don't even know what the specific question will be. But the first thing I ever said up here when I came up here was, nobody has a water right. Every water right, production right, is vulnerable. Even if you have a really easy to compute allocation under water rights priorities, which we may have here in a certain way, the doctrine of reasonable and beneficial use is imbued on that, and you have to answer the question. Everybody can't survive. It's possible that everybody can't survive with a 3/4 cutback. And so how do you cope with that, and how does the board decide what are its policy, what what are its policies, and what are the values it's trying to maintain, all of which turn on continued water production in some amount for some period or not. And so I respect every opinion you may hear again tonight that I've seen many times, whether it comes from Searles, or it comes from Mojave Pistachio, or it comes from Meadowbrooks, or anybody else. Small Ag, all have their opinion. Mr. Panzer's views have been made well known about what he thinks the idea of reasonable beneficial use should mean in this circumstance, and it's all in play as far as I'm concerned. I only promise this: when the board has in front of it a final implementation plan, I will tell them that I think that's a viable plan that can be defended legally. I'm not going to guarantee you that some court or a series of appellate courts are going to agree that's a reasonable approach, and you've applied the doctrine of reasonable beneficial use and other legal doctrines appropriately under these circumstances. But I am going to be able to tell them, don't do that, because you're not going to get that result if you take the next step. They'll get that kind of guidance. So these aren't the kind of things where you can, here, I'll give you an unqualified legal opinion. It's not going to happen here. But we do have to tell the board where we think they're exposed to legal attack if they make certain decisions. But this is not like saying, well, you got a contract, you got 4 years to sue somebody if they breach it. It's that simple, cut and dried, black and white. That's not what we're dealing with here. The other thing in this slide that's interesting that I think is an overstatement of the last two bullet points there, where they cite these sections of SGMA, and a lot of people are throwing around this language in a way that I don't understand. I don't think anybody could. So all SGMA is saying is that when water allocation is made by the agency board, that's not the end of the discussion, and the agency board has to comply with common law water rights provisions in California as well as federal law. Yes, that is true. If you fly in the face of that, there's a problem. But again, I'll say again, under all circumstances, priority water rights have been modified, intercepted, and changed because courts, particularly the California Supreme Court, have found numerous times the strict application of those priorities would be an unreasonable use of water. And I could give you 5 or 6 examples sitting right here where that's been held. So that's always in place. So the level of certainty you get isn't so great. There's another case called in-ray water of stream water case, where Justice Mosk essentially deprioritized all then not exercised riparian rights, saying that nobody can plan how much water they can extract from their wells or divert from the stream for beneficial use if they have to worry about 10 years later some riparian sitting on a big hunk of land that's not doing anything inserts himself and wipes out their management decisions by asserting a down-the-line in futura priority right. So that's a legal doctrine in play. And in the end, it says that the agency board is not entitled to make final decisions or determinations of water rights, but I don't think that's as meaningful as some people think, because in this plan, or the implementation of this plan, when we have enough data, there will be allocations of pumping rights that are quantified. And those will be based on, and will only happen after we hear lots of lawyers telling us why it's right or wrong in this room. And that's a decision the board makes. It's not final, because DWR has to review that, and whatever DWR says, the courts can review that. So by definition, any water rights determination or allocation quantity is subject to all of those reviews. So I look forward to your questions, and I will try. I'm not going to try to dance around any of the questions that are on everybody's mind. I think you'll see the end of the presentation on the plan itself, where you get to theories of allocation and what the values are that are at the heart of this draft plan, that it'll generate the questions, because I think it's pretty clear what the draft recommends as a priority. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And just so you folks know, I think I said this already, but part of the reason we wanted to get Jim up here first, because it was obviously very informative and a good introduction presentation, but to get you folks comfortable with the fact that Jim's here. If there's questions, Jeff's going to be up here for a long time doing the section by section PowerPoint for the presentation. But I want to make sure that we wanted to make sure that everybody knew that Jim's here for you for questions, and we can make sure that you're all comfortable bringing legal questions into this. So the next thing I wanted to do, and this is real, I let you know before that we did have a schedule included in this PowerPoint. It kind of follows the schedule that David described, so you can take it with you and make notes on it. It mentions right up at the front, November 4th, TAC PAC review of the draft GSP. That's when Heather got it out. It was like 7 or 8 o'clock at night when she finally got it out, but it got out on the 4th. This is at the 7th. We're having a combined PAC-TAC meeting to kind of walk through it for everybody. David mentioned comments are due by November 15th. We'd like to have them, morning, noon, something like that, so we can get them in and get working on them. We're listing that we're going to review and incorporate those TAC-PAC comments for preparation of the public review draft from like the 18th to the 2nd, which is when it's got to come out. So I didn't put the schedule together, but it looks like Heather gave herself the weekend off between the 15th and the 18th. There might be a correction there. But anyway, it shows the 15th and the 18th when we're actually going to work on that. So at that point, we will have a review draft out for public review that will have addressed the PAC-TAC comments. So we probably will not do a formal written review of all the comments. We'll incorporate them kind of like we've done with the sections we've done so far. But that'll come out in the public review draft on the 2nd. So that's when the public review period begins. There will be additional opportunity during the public review period for the TAC PAC, for the public, for everybody, board members, everybody, because it'll be out, to be able to review the public review draft and provide comments. It was mentioned earlier about an evening board workshop on the public review draft. We mentioned the week, I think, of the 9th, and I think, just so you folks know, I talked to Don a little earlier, and we've had a couple of calls about it. They're looking at the 12th, a Thursday the 12th. So if you want to put that date down, that might be a good idea to reserve that date as an evening board workshop on the draft GSP. We can't set it without board action, which will be in a couple of weeks. But just to let you know, we're looking at, it looked like that was a week that kind of fit, and the timing, there's Aqua and there's other things the week before, so it looked like that was a good week. So the 12th is what we're looking at on Thursday right now, but it's not set till the board does it. We're going to be requesting comments back on the public review draft as much as we can by the 6th, so we can try to address those for the actual public hearing, that hearing that will occur on January 16th. That gives us 10 days to do it. For the public hearing on the GSP, we will need to, our intent would be to provide written responses to all comments that are received from the 2nd through the January 16th board meeting. So how that happens, if we get comments at the board meeting, I'm not sure, but we will try to provide oral comments at the board meeting that we receive even at the public hearing, because that's the intent, is a public hearing to get public comment, and that's going to close it. But up till that point, we're going to be assembling comments, and with the final draft that the board approves that night, the one that gets approved, and then we pull together and send to DWR. Included with that, our intention to include that with that would be written responses to all comments, a lot like you do with an EIR or a CEQA document. So you may not see them on the 16th, but they will go with the final draft that goes to DWR.
Steve?
Yes.
A question.
Sure.
Is that workshop open to the public?
Yes. The intent was a public workshop. It was Supervisor Gleason's idea. At a board meeting I was at, and everybody nodded and said they wanted to do it. I haven't heard anything since that suggested they weren't going to do it.
Do we have a possible time?
I would think it's going to be an evening meeting. What's an evening meeting? Probably 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, something like that on the 12th. But it's a board. It's still got to be approved by the board.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Okay. So then we had the hearing on the 16th, and then we're going to have a little time to pull together the final draft and get it to DWR like we need to, along with the responses to written comments. So that's the schedule. You all have it. We'd be happy to answer questions about that too once we get all done. But now we're going to get into the good stuff, the important stuff, and I think Jeff's going to walk through section by section. It's going to take a little time. Bear with us. I think David kind of mentioned it. If at least from the PAC and TAC, if there is something that really is puzzling to you, just like was done just now, ask a question for clarification. It's probably okay to do that during the presentation. But then when we get all done, we'll take comments and questions on the whole thing. Okay?
Yeah, I'd really urge the members, write your questions down. If we bombard clarifications as we go, we'll be here all night.
Right. Thanks.
So we want to get all the way through this, have as much clarity as we can.
Yep.
So take notes on your slides. When the TAC turn comes, TAC questions, then PAC questions, then public.
Okay, thanks, David. So anyway, here's Jeff.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to, my intent is to, I'm sure you haven't had a chance to review all of the report yet, but to give you an overview to help you when you do go to read the whole report. So some of the chapters I'm not going to go into very much detail about. You've seen some of the sections before. I'm going to highlight what we changed based on the comments that you had all provided before. Some of the things I've got a little more detail on. We'll spend a little more time on them. So Section 1 had been out before, a draft of it. We've added the checklist to the end of it. We've revised some of the descriptions in it based on the comments that we received, but I think it largely will look familiar to you. Section 2 on the plan area. We've expanded the discussion of the data management system to try and satisfy some of the SGMA requirements in that description. Changed some of the descriptions of the local agencies based on comments we got. Lorelei pointed out that some of the data we had for land use in Kern County was dated and gave us some updated information, so that's all been revised. In the basin setting in Section 3, it's been reorganized a little bit. We've incorporated several comments that we've received there. There's added discussion of sustainable yield in the write-up. We've updated the subsidence discussion for current conditions on subsidence. Added some discussion of groundwater-dependent ecosystems, although they're not one of the sustainability indicators. We are required to address that. There's a description of the transport model that wasn't in before, a description of the baseline conditions that were modeled, and scenario 6.2 is described. The data gap evaluation's been updated. Going to Section 4, the sustainable management criteria. The sustainability goal was revised based on the comments we received from the PAC and the TAC. I won't read through it all here, but we do have it in the handout. Going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the criteria. The criteria for reduction in storage. We've used the modeling results, which are graphed here, of the reduction in storage from 2020 to 2070. You'll see that the bottom line, kind of orange line, is the minimum threshold. And we basically took the amount of depletion of storage that the model projected for modeling run 6.2, and to provide us with some operational flexibility, because there are some uncertainties in what was modeled and how things will be implemented, we added 10% to that as our minimum threshold. So we would have undesirable effects if we were to go 10% below what the model had projected as water from storage that was used by 2070, which was around 215,000 acre feet. We set our measurable objective, that is, where do we want to end up at that 215,000 acre feet? And then we use the modeling results. We have to set interim objectives at every 5 years out to 2040, and we use the modeling results to set those. That's where we're going to try and hit in each one of the 5-year reviews that we do. For the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, and I'm going to have a couple of examples about how we applied this. We'll be looking at the hydrograph for Kerr-McGee well and for MW32 when we get to it. But we've picked 10 wells as being representative monitoring wells. We will, of course, use all of the water level data that's going to be gathered, to analyze the basin, but as sort of our representation of our goals and our thresholds, we've picked these representative wells that are shown here. We used both historical data and modeling results to set the criteria, and I'll show a couple of examples of that. This is the Kerr-McGee well, and the light blue is historical data, and then the darker blue line is what was modeled. And we have taken the low point in the modeled groundwater levels at this point, and again, to add some operational flexibility, we've subtracted 5 feet from that as our minimum threshold. That's the level we do not want to go below. And we selected that when we looked at sort of timing of both the allocation process and the imported water project. What if they were different than what was modeled in scenario 6.2 to look at what the differences could be in water levels and provide us with some flexibility if things change in the future. So that's how we established the minimum threshold. Our objective in this case is where we want to end up at is we picked the 2040 modeled groundwater level as our objective, where we'd like to get to in this particular well, and then use the modeling results to set the 5-year milestones that we want to hit. In this case, we just matched the modeling results with the most recent actual piece of data we had on a water level here. We needed to adjust them a little bit to get them to line up and see what we thought they would be more representative of what's going to occur. In a case like this one, which is MW32, you see a lot of seasonal variation and effects from pumping nearby there. And instead of linking it to the most recent piece of data, we took the average of the most recent 3 water level measurements and adjusted the start of our projected groundwater levels from the model at that point. And you see the trend is pretty good to the historic trend that was there. And again, we took the low point as projected by the model and set our minimum threshold 5 feet below that, and then used the modeling results to set our interim thresholds. And our objective is, again, the model projected year 2040 water level.
Jeff,
Yes.
you only used the last 3?
There's a trend there that's all of that data, the light dash line that really doesn't show up on the screen, but we used all of the data to do an historical trend. But to adjust...
Let me interrupt really quickly, just to remember. Can you please write your questions and comments and thoughts down, and let's hold on to those till the end, because we've got a lot to go through here. Thank you, though, Earl.
But I'm going to finish, since I'm halfway through it. But just to adjust what the model said was the projected water levels, it didn't quite match up with those. We used the most recent 3 years average, and matched our starting point of what we're showing as modeling results to that number. And as you can see, it kind of matched up fairly well. In some cases, we did use, and I don't have an example of it here, the historical low as our minimum and then going below that 5 feet because the modeling, I've forgotten what it looked like, but it wasn't as clear as this, that we'd get the operational flexibility if we used the modeling results, and instead we used the historical low and took 5 feet from that. So you'll see that in some of the examples. We've got charts like this for all of the representative monitoring wells are in the plan. So the criteria for degraded water quality, these are the 11 representative wells that we've selected to represent those criteria, and I'll be showing examples of the Water District's well number 30 and the Water District's well number 33. The slide mentions we selected 11 wells, but we only set management criteria for 6 of those wells. As we were looking through the data in these other areas, some of those wells had very little data. Really, that was the main problem. There just wasn't enough data, and it wasn't recent enough for us to feel confident that we could set management criteria for all of those. So we've noted that. That's a data gap in the plan. There's some baseline water quality data that was collected, I think, last week and I think this coming week. What we say in the plan is we'll get 3 years of data on those wells and come back and revisit this issue of what the criteria should be for those representative wells. So this is the Water District's well number 30. As you can see, it's got a good, quite a bit of historic data, and we've got the trend line there. To set the water quality criteria, we use pretty much exclusively the historical trends. We looked at some of the transport modeling results, but the historical trends seem to be a better guide to us in looking at these. And what we did was take the projection. Well, we took the, for this particular well, all of the water quality is well below the MCL of 500, so we've set the MCL of 500 as our minimum threshold. The modeling results show we shouldn't, if all the plan's implemented as it's laid out and as it was modeled, we shouldn't get to that point, so we've taken the projection out to the year 3030, which is when we'll have most of the not the management action, but most of the projects implemented. Oh, and the management action, sorry. The imported water project won't be implemented by 2030, or 2030, at least not the way we modeled it, it wasn't. But we took that historical trend projection to 2030 as our interim goal. The modeling indicated the water quality should start to stabilize at about that time, so we've set the interim all the interim milestones at about the same number, or at the same number, sorry. And so the minimum threshold is the MCL, and then our objective would be, where we want to end up, is we hope that the water quality won't be any worse than it is at the last reading that was taken. The modeling indicates we should see some improvement in water quality. The two examples I have, the minimum threshold are both at 500, but the water quality varies throughout the basin, and so it does with the representative wells we've shown. So some of the representative wells that we selected are already above 500. So to provide some flexibility, we set a higher goal, a higher minimum threshold than 500. We set it at 600. The representative wells were below that for most part, although some are even higher than that. So we set a minimum threshold on those of 1,000. So this is Water District's well 33. As you can see, the historical trend is flat, or actually improving slightly over time. And here we set the minimum threshold at 500. We set our objective where we want to be at the highest recent concentration, and then set our objectives at the same as the measurable objective. The interim milestones are the same as the measurable objective in this case. So in land subsidence, following our last discussion of the TAC of subsidence, which was very helpful, we got good input at that meeting. We've identified, we think the key infrastructure, or at least it's representative of sensitive infrastructure, is the SNORT facility. There are other facilities that could be impacted, but that's one that's historically has had line level surveys done on it. We relied heavily on the paper that Steve Bacon with DRI wrote reviewing subsidence and change in ground level, both to tectonic activity and trying to separate out impact from lowering groundwater levels. Use a lot of the information out of that as our guidance, and basically set our minimum thresholds. Our minimum threshold is at that facility. We do have a discussion that there's additional monitoring points that the Navy's considering. I had a discussion with Matt Boggs. A great deal of data following the earthquakes has been collected by a number of organizations, and it is all coming forward. We're going to have a much better, I think, understanding of activity going forward that will be very useful to review when we do a 5-year update on this. That's not all available, or at least it's not all analyzed and summarized as it applies to what we're looking at yet. But the data that has been summarized, we took the most recent period that was looked at and set that as our minimum threshold. We don't want to go above, what was seen in that historical period. And in fact, well, actually, I think we used one of the higher rates over a longer period as our minimum threshold, and some of the lower, more recent rates as both our measurable objective and our interim milestone. I think as more sampling points or monitoring points are put in place and more of the data that's been collected is analyzed, we'll be able to go back and revisit these. And as we implement the management actions and the projects and see how that is affecting this, we can refine these even better. We don't have a good tool to project how reducing the decline in groundwater level is going to affect the land subsidence. So all we had was the ability to look back at historically what does the analysis show. On interconnected surface water, I don't think this is too new. I think it generally falls in line with what we talked about with the TAC, that there aren't any really significant interconnected groundwater systems. Some in the canyon, canyons, maybe some springs that we really don't have any data about. The lowering of groundwater levels and how that affects some of the springs around the playa. And one of the other things we have to address is groundwater-dependent ecosystems. We don't have specific numbers on those interconnections, but we do have information that the general lowering of groundwater levels in the playa area have impacted some of the vegetation there. So there is an impact. Some of the modeling we did in scenario 6.1, we tried to sort of counteract those continually declining groundwater levels out under the playa by putting more imported water on, and in the time frame that we modeled out to 2070, it didn't seem to show any benefit. That's an area where we think we need more data to see what, if anything, we can do about that area. It's remote for the most part from where we pump and from where we actively manage. So we have a difficult time putting anything in place that would address those. So onto the section 5 with the projects and management actions. We've got I think, a pretty extended write-up on the allocation, the annual pumping allocation plan, what's been called now the transient pool and the fallowing program. We had discussions in modeling in 6.2 and various modeling scenarios about all kinds of different allocations. What's presented in the plan is similar to the allocation table that was presented at the last PAC and TAC. There's now more text describing that. It would be used not to restrict pumping, but as a basis for assigning pumping fees. All pumpers would be allowed to pump. If you don't get an allocation of the natural safe yield of the basin and you pump, you would pay the augmentation fee. There'll be a process to go through that allocation. The table that was presented was examples, got disclaimers in it. We going to have a process for people to present more data, for the board to consider how to set the allocations. But some of the things that need to be considered when that allocation is set are listed here. The federally reserved rights. So, Jim Markman talked about California water rights and the beneficial uses, historical groundwater production, and the requirements for health and safety all be considered in those allocations. All the pumpers that don't get who pump during the base period, the 2010 to 2014, but don't get an allocation of the natural yield, will be given part of the transient pool. The transient pool is a limited, non-transferable, one-time allocation water that's intended to be used by the year 2040. As we've talked about when we were talking about some of the modeling runs, the intent behind it is to provide some flexibility for the reductions that need to be made. There had been suggestions of a fallowing program. We hadn't really talked about one in any detail or at all in the TAC meetings, although in public comment they had been made and suggested that we ought to have some way to pay ag or others for not using the water. So the concept of a fallowing program that's voluntary. If you have a transient pool allocation, you have the ability to sell that allocation back to the Groundwater Authority. There's I think, a process described about how we'll get through and develop the allocations. The intent is we'll show the schedule a little later on, but as soon as we adopt the board adopts the groundwater sustainability plan, to start on that allocation process. So our project number one is develop an imported water supply. This is, in the two options that we've talked about, the TAC and the PAC, are what's in the plan, getting into water from AVEC that would be treated water that we would take for direct use to the water district and perhaps to others, because it is treated water when we get it from AVEC. And then the other option is a potential exchange with LA Department of Water and Power to get water out of the LA Aqueduct, and we've gone over before all of the steps that might be required to do that. The recycled water project that it's been some time, but we talked about with the TAC, is one of the projects that's proposed. The city has been planning to improve or replace the existing wastewater treatment plant. What's proposed as a project is putting it to additional beneficial uses. We identified landscape irrigation where it could be put to use, and where we had some leftover recycled water that wasn't used for landscape irrigation, we have a component of the project that could be groundwater recharge through injection, which would require additional treatment to be able to do. One of the projects is a basin-wide water conservation efforts. We haven't developed specific recommendations in that. The Water District has, of course, been doing conservation programs effectively for some time. The Navy has done conservation, and others have. Ag has, and industry has. But with the condition the basin is, I think the Groundwater Authority's role would simply be to try and facilitate amongst those groups, get people together who've been doing these things and see what else could be done. Probably anything else that's going to be done as far as conservation is going to take additional money. The Groundwater Authority could act as a vehicle to try and get state or federal grant funds to try and implement some of those things. There we go. I think you've seen the elements of the shallow well mitigation program. We had an outline for it. We've incorporated that into the GSP as a project, and one of the projects that would be implemented soon after adopting the GSP. We fleshed it out a little bit more with text in the plan. We've included a dust control mitigation program. Again, there's not specific proposals, for specific properties in there. We have examples of the type of programs that have been implemented in other places. That's the plan would need to be developed, shortly after the GSP. The details of the plan would need to be developed shortly after the GSP is adopted. As we talked about when we were discussing modeling scenario 6.2, to minimize some of the, even when we reduce pumping in the basin, there's still entities that are going to be pumping, and to reduce impacts on shallow wells and continually declining groundwater levels in some of the pumping centers, it would be necessary to relocate some of the pumping, potentially the water districts or SERLs, up into the northwest area on Brown Road. So we've included that as a project. And the ones I just described are the major projects that are included in the plan. We certainly don't have to stop at those projects. The Groundwater Authority has the ability to continue to look at projects, so we've included some additional projects that are being looked at or will be looked at in the future and could be incorporated or implemented to help get the basin to sustainability, including the brackish water project. And we've listed the direct potable use of recycled water as a potential future project. There aren't regulations that currently exist that would allow us to, determine exactly how we'd be able to do that here. There are, entities in the state that are working on implementing those. The state is going to look at setting some guidelines for certain types of direct use projects, but those are things like if you've got a surface water treatment plant and you do advanced treatment on the recycled water and then put it through your surface water treatment plant, they're going to develop some guidelines for that. We don't have that situation here, so there aren't even any proposed schedule to have regulations where we might be able to directly put recycled water into a potable system right now. But that doesn't mean that that won't happen at some point. So we think it's something we've kept on a list of potential projects in the future to keep an eye on. These are the implementation years, as I say, the pumping allocations, as soon as we get the plan approved, we anticipate we'll be starting the allocation process. We've talked about imported water for the, for the plan. We're been assuming that we could have imported water online by 2035. Of the optimization of recycled water online by 2025. Start looking at conservation efforts in 2020. We'll start looking at the shallow well mitigation program in 2020, but probably won't have all the criteria and everything done until 2021. The same with the dust mitigation, and then pumping optimization out in 2025. I believe we'd shown the potential funding sources that will be looked at, and in fact, this list is from Capital Corps. I mean, they've had some initial discussions with different entities about some of these sources, and I think had some encouraging feedback from people they talked to on various combinations of these funding sources that are included in the plan. Will need to be developed further. And then we've added costs, both sort of the development and capital cost and the annual cost for the projects and the management actions. We don't have the administration in there. That's being worked on right now. Don's and his staff are spearheading that. We should have that for the next public review draft. The board will be talking about budgets, and I think a lot of what comes out of their discussion of budgets will go into what's going to be in the administrative budget here. That's the overview I have. Flip a coin.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead and start with questions, comments, and other items of this nature to the TAC members. Wade, we're going to start at your side. And if everybody needs just a couple minutes to kind of go back through any comments that they've made, please do that now, because I know we flipped through this rather quickly. But whatever your questions or comments are, go ahead and just re-look through if you need to. We'll give you the time needed, and go ahead and, if you've got questions or comments, it's your turn now, Wade.
So not a lot, given that the document is 886 pages long, so we're still working through that. But given that changes have already been made based on prior feedback, will there be...
Wade, that microphone I don't think works. You're going to have to lean to the one next to you, unfortunately. I just remembered that, sorry.
Can I just use my drill voice?
Everybody in the audience, can you hear him?
So will there be time for additional adjustments to some of the sustainable management criteria as part of this next round of revisions if we go through this with a fine-tooth comb and suggest things?
Yes.
Okay. Second question I have relates to the implementation and all of the annual costs. I guess when the smoke clears, from a policy perspective, what are the effects on the water rates for the people in the valley who will be charged for all of this stuff? What is the net effect when you consider all of the CapEx and the OpEx and the annual costs in terms of the impact that a typical ratepayer might pay?
We have not analyzed that, and frankly, I don't think some of these projects can be implemented unless we get public funding, and how much public funding we get would impact that. So we haven't even attempted to look at that.
I think it's my turn. Actually, I've read through the 6 sections myself pretty carefully. Actually, Judy has too, even though the time was really short. There's a lot of small details that I've got questions about that are not appropriate here. I'll give you an example of something that is, it's kind of a small point, but for example, in section 1, the title page is, it reads correctly and so on. But then when you get to the actual body, it's called section 2. There's a misnumbering. And there are, I don't know, probably a dozen things I've noticed that are similar to that. I think you guys have done a really good job of working through the previous discussions and suggestions that you got from the 2 committees. I think it's pretty clear in your writing that you've spent a lot of time perfecting your sentence structure and all too. It's a big improvement over some of the earlier section versions. One of the aspects that I think needs to be looked at a little more carefully, you're using the word fallowing in a specific way in what to me is a buyback. It's a buyout. And fallowing in the agricultural sense means that the field will be allowed to lie quiet for a period of time and then brought back into some kind of crop production, and that's not what you're talking about. I think it's a point of confusion that you can read what you've got and fix. In a lot of cases, I think really you're talking about a purchase of the property's water rights, the water allocations. Although, especially in the desert environment, the bare property without that water right isn't worth a whole lot. The possibility of a PV project potentially, except that Edison isn't going to give us an enhanced grid access anytime in the foreseeable future. So why one, would be interested in selling the water rights just at the and retain the property without them, I don't see how one could argue for that. But I understand what you're trying to do. Just some comments. And I've got many others that are more detailed that I'll put into my comments back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of your really hard work.
Well, thank you. And I mean, that's exactly why we wanted to come to the PAC and TAC to get comments before we put a public review draft, because we know it'll make it better. The comments we got on the sections we had already given out help make that better, as you're pointing out, Don. And Wade, that question about the sustainability criteria, we'll certainly look at any comments that we get, and we want to make it a better plan if we can.
So I can't report that I've done as much homework as Don and Judy have, but I have looked over a fair amount of the document, and I want to commend you as well on the work that you guys have been doing. It's a very tough charge. Rather than go into specific details I have on each of the sections, I think it's better for me to just submit that to you by next week in written form. But I know there's going to be a lot of questions from the public, but something has just occurred to me as we went through your presentation is that we haven't presented a future view. We're making a stab, an educated stab right now. I don't mean that offensively, but we are taking a stab at what we think the valley is all about. The amount of water we use, we sort of know, but we don't really know. How much is coming into the aquifer? We have a good estimate, but we haven't really proven it exactly. as we go into the future, we are going to know more about how much water is being pulled out. We're going to be able to monitor more accurately the water levels across the valley, and we're probably going to be able to see that there's adjustments available to us, whether it's more draconian uses, right, or restrictions on water use, or perhaps we might, if Pollyanna happens, maybe we'll have, a lessening or a less charge. So I'm rambling here a little bit, but I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that anybody, a part of the boards, can envision how we might have that discussion during the public disclosure on the 12th. Because this document really, this gives us a plan of action, but it doesn't really talk about what adjustments we might make and when we might make those in the future. Is it a 5-year update? Is it an annual? Is it 6 months? What actions are we going to be taking to help us make those decisions and feedback to the public?
That's a good point. I mean, there is some discussion about, the plan's intended to be adaptive to as we get more information or the conditions change or we know more, that we have the ability to adapt. I don't know if we can make a blanket statement about exactly when we'll do that. It could probably vary for the different, depending on when we get information and what program we're talking about. There's a statement under the allocations that they can be reevaluated as we go forward. So there's certainly the intent to do that. It seems like the most logical place will be at the 5-year reviews, because we're going to need more data or know how circumstances have changed, say with an imported water project. We're sometimes going to need to go by for us to look and say, well, what does that mean to what we wrote at this time? But that's certainly the intent.
I don't really have any comments at this time. You guys are doing a marvelous job.
Oh, thank you.
I do have comments. And I did remember what I was mentioning to Steve on the 10-page document, in the first paragraph, last sentence or so, it says that you will adaptively management. That needs to be corrected, like through adaptive management. Other things, where is number 5, section 5? I was not able to acquire that. Is that because it's in process right now?
No, anybody else see it? Should have been there.
No, I tried to get it off of the Google Drive and it didn't come down with the rest of them.
Earl, can you get the website? You can a simplified version of it's on the GA website under the GSP chapter section.
I followed the link that Heather sent.
Yeah, that was harder.
And the public library system is very slow when they zip and unzip. So I did get the figures and went through all those. They need work. Still, county lines aren't in a lot of them. I've got a question about one of them in section 5. What's the diameter of the pipe that goes to Cal City?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Does Cal City approve of our tapping into their line?
They don't own the line. AVEC does.
Okay.
We would take it off of AVEC's portion, and we did talk to them. They're definitely open. They have unused capacity in the pipeline.
So it's not full all the time?
That's right.
Oh, that's interesting. Another item I noticed was on the pump stations. I don't think you really need 2. I think you can get away with 1. You might use a different route and just use gravity.
We did not optimize the route. There's a lot of right-of-way issues to consider, environmental impacts to consider. We took what we thought was a feasible route, and we put 2 pump stations in because with 1 we developed some pretty high pressures at the low point. But this was a conceptual project, and we certainly would want to do a lot more engineering on that going forward.
napkin at lunch.
A little more than that, but
Okay, another item on figures. The springs and creeks. I did notice that on the east side of the base, that those springs actually drain into Cyril's Valley and not into the Indian Wells Water Basin. And I will write this up, because there's a lot more. I could spend an hour talking about your figures. So I will yield the floor.
we look forward to getting your comments.
Thank you, Earl. Right in front of you there is a copy of the draft given, Chapter 5.
From Laurel.
From Laurel.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And the county's done for you.
Pass it up.
It's right there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's for you.
She snuck it in.
Thank you, Lorelei.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I guess just for some clarification on when we provide written comments to you by noon on the 15th, and those go to Adam, he compiles them, sends them to you. It's obvious to me, I guess I disagree a little bit with Dawn. Some of the comments that at least I've provided, and there were technical comments that have impacts on things that were done, weren't incorporated. So how do we get some assurance that there's a process developed that they're going to be, either incorporated, hopefully, or addressed? So on this initial TAC PAC review, I would love to trust Steve saying Eddie will work on them, but it was obvious that some of these comments were not incorporated. So how do I get some assurances that happens?
We got a lot of comments. We got some conflicting comments. Not all of them are going to get incorporated.
Right.
We welcome them, and we'll evaluate them and incorporate what we think improves the plan.
So as an example, I think you have two cross sections that were developed by others. I think back in 1991 in two areas, but there's areas in the subbasin that are very critical. Northwest Brown along North Brown Road. There's no cross sections developed through those areas, and those are kind of critical areas as we kind of move through and decisions that are being made. So I think you kind of need to up your game a little bit on some of the you need to interpolate some of that existing data, and there's new data out there. So there are going to be heavy lifts, and I don't know how you're going to do it, but I think that's something that it's unfortunate it didn't get incorporated originally. But anyway, I'll provide them again, just so you don't forget. And then another question I have, I think it's on slide 21, and this has always kind of bothered me, and maybe you can help clarify it. So we're talking about land subsidence, and specifically in and around the snort alignment. So with how this Federal Reserve water right plays in, and I'm guessing the only way you're going to avoid subsidence in and around the snort areas, you have to restrict pumping. That pumping is going to be Navy pumping. So how do you jump through the hoops to make that happen? Because in theory, if you impact that threshold or objective, it's on the GSP's back, but you have to sort of force the Navy to reduce pumping if there's issues out there with the snort subsidence area, and then also with the GDEs. I mean, GDEs, they're big on the playa, but other than the Navy, how do we have an impact on that?
I don't know exactly where the Navy's pumping is.
Well, I think we do, but I mean, yeah.
I have not seen a figure with their wells on them.
So I'm saying that could be a problem if you leave it in the GSP. So,
but when you look at the contours, I don't see any big pumping centers. What's impacting those water levels is all the pumping in the south east area and the southwest area, and to some extent Brown Road. The impacts of the big pumping centers are extending clear back onto the base. And especially when we model going into the future, that continues to happen.
Yeah, we can discuss the pros and cons of that. But anyway,
we don't have a mechanism to control the Navy's pumping.
Right, so that could have an impact on GDEs subsidence. So I think it's going to be tricky to kind of implement that. And then also, I didn't see this in there. Again, just given the sensitivity of this area, the de-designated area. There's been some estimates of how much water's in there. I mean, is it worth maybe having that as a project to kind of look and see what it would take to utilize some of that water? I mean, I know it's again on the Navy area, but it's in this sub-basin where it's there's so much pumping going on, and what you're doing, or what could happen with certain entities. I mean, there's things I think we need to do and think outside the box a little bit, but it's going to take a group effort. So it's just something to kind of put out there. I'll put a comment in, and then also on some of the costing in chapter and implementation of the project management actions. One that kind of jumped out to me was sort of with dust control. I think I saw a number of, I think it was like $19 million for dust control. I mean, I think we probably need a little more detail at some point on what does that involve? Does that include buying out certain areas, or is that just having, somebody go out there and spray the fields once a week?
That was not a buyout, and that's a potential range of costs. We took some of the, I think that was one of the more expensive dust control management measures.
Yeah.
And we took, frankly, most, if not all, of the ag land, and said, what if we had to do dust control on all of it? And
so
said,
I think there needs to be some detail in there, a little more detail.
About where the number came
or
from.
How you,
Okay.
water truck costs this, and, kind of thing. So
Good comment.
Yeah. That's all I have for now. Thanks.
Thanks. Is this working? Yeah. Interesting thought about the Navy's pumping, and if the Navy saw subsidence around snort. But I would just imagine that if the Navy knew that they were doing something causing subsidence at the snort, they would do something about it. But interesting point to bring up. I had several comments looking for detail on some of these points, like the shallow well mitigation program and the dust control program. Missing a little bit of detail. Sorry, Jeff. I need to turn my back to you to speak into the microphone, but I think some of this points to maybe the philosophy of the plan more of, for example, the plans states develop criteria to characterize the level of impacts and various things, plans to develop processes. Mm-hmm. And you're not really fleshing that out into a plan. What seems like that's the purpose of the plan, is to flesh out all the details. So what is the plan for developing those detailed plans? Is that you're just stating that we'll be doing these things and we'll be working on them, and at some point, is there going to be, when is the detail going to show up? I think that's my overall point here.
Yeah, my expectation is we would work with the TAC on that. We'd had some discussions about what things need to be considered. Certainly how the well was constructed, when it was constructed, and together kind of come up with a set of criteria to evaluate. Okay, what is an impact? They're not all just going to go dry and not pump any water. Is it a reduction in its capacity? How much? Is that a criteria we want to use? Water quality criteria. We'd work with the PAC on the TAC and potentially the PAC on what things do we want to consider in those evaluations, and that's how we would flesh out this plan. This overall planning document, this GSP, we just wanted to put forward that that's something that needs to get done. We've got an outline of what it would entail. But we don't have the details on that. That would be put together going forward.
Is that not an expectation from DWR when they review this for completeness? They just want to know that you're going to be thinking about this stuff in the future and maybe not flesh out all the details?
No, they don't expect to see every detail in all of these. It has to have a certain amount of information in it. And we explain how we're going to get there. That's one of the key things. If we don't have all the details, we need to explain how we're going to get there and when we're going to get there.
That's fine. I will just say that that's one question in particular about the mitigation, the shallow well mitigation plan. I've received questions personally about how that's going to be accomplished. Is it a monetary reimbursement for deepening or whatever? And you've just talked about some of the criteria you go through, but people are wondering, well, will they be put on supplied water or something like that if their wells go dry? Those are the kinds of questions I'm getting, and frankly, they're not fleshed out here, so it's going to leave that question open. That's all.
Okay, so I'm definitely with my back to you, Jeff. And I really haven't had a chance to review this at all. I was in a meeting all day yesterday and traveled down here today. So I don't have much in the way of comments. I guess one thing I noted that the implementation plan is really still being developed. So maybe you could just expand, if you could expand a little bit. I guess the main question I would have is how much detail are you going to have for the first few years? I would assume you're going to have some sort of a budget put together so that we can, so that the authority can see what the costs are going to be in the first few years for planning purposes. I guess that's just a comment and a question, and maybe you could expand a little bit on it. Thanks.
Well, we propose that the implementation plan is what you see in, at this point, is what you see in chapter or section 6. We hadn't planned on putting much more detail, as into what are the next couple of years of budget. We have sort of the total overall capital or development costs and then a typical annual cost. We were thinking something like that would be a going forward issue with the groundwater authority. They're going to, there's assessments that are talked about being set at some point. Those are the kind of things that would have to be looked at there. But we weren't anticipating putting more detail into those right now.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. At this time, I don't have any other comments. Yeah, I've taken a whole lot of notes, and we appreciate this opportunity that we've had some time to take a look and see here. Yes, we did receive, I took a look at the other items yesterday and today's, lots of questions for Section 4 and Section 6, but I will get those written down, and we will send those to you. And thank you for the week's timing that we have. And just letting everybody know we still do have good time to sit down and go through these and give you our comments and additional questions. I wanted to thank the TAC members for your comments and thoughts, and also thank you for getting it in mind. We do have this additional time to go through, write everything down. Reminder, please send it to me via email, or if you need to mail it as well, you're welcome to do that too, or you can actually mail it to the Indian Wells Valley Water District, and they will take them and give them to Stetson as well. I think that is pretty much it for the TAC side. Yeah, all of my comments that I wrote down here, it's fine for me to just send them to you. And so I wanted to say thank you. And are there any other comments or questions from TAC members at this time?
Yes. The due date for comments?
The 15th, so next.
A week from tomorrow.
A week from tomorrow, next Friday, by noon, as Dave mentioned earlier. So, and yes, Don.
We're on. In listening to the comments that the other members of the TAC have provided, I think we all sense that we've got it's more than an outline of the plan, and some of the areas are considerably, are developed into considerably more detail. I think the implementation plan is going to contain a lot of the really hard thinking required to bring out the allocation numbers and pumping costs and so on. I think basic structure is there. I think a lot of us felt a little bit disturbed that there wasn't more detail, but we also understand exactly where the limitations are in terms of Stetson's time, for example. I thought it was useful to state that.
Thank you. And the other item, this is a presentation, so we do understand that you're trying to put a load of this information into something that we are simply aware of, that we need to keep in mind as we review everything that we have. But I do agree already with a couple comments that both Don and Tim and Earl and Wade also made, and Mal, about descriptions. A lot of these items are going to need more descriptions. For instance, shallow wells impacted, eligible for mitigation pending the evaluation of the impacts. Is that going to be added, that description of what those evaluations will be, so that all people who have a possibility that their shallow wells may be impacted, they will be aware of the evaluations that are needed and how they can access those, who they will need to contact. And I know that takes place in the future after the GSP is approved. And then, of course, every year there's an opportunity for these discussions to be made. And then all the 5 years, of course, those are important as well. So, yeah. Go ahead, Eddie.
Just because I wanted to address Stefan's question about the shallow well mitigation program, or at least as another example. So in one of my comments, I provided Stetson sort of an outline of what other agencies are doing to sort of develop that. So if you want a copy of it, I'll send it to you. But again, those are the kind of things that it's important that everybody gets to look at everybody else's comments, and there has to be a process to track them, which it hasn't happened. So anyway, yeah.
Just also remember, your comments and information that you send to me to be given, those will be included with the comments that the public will be giving when they are given their opportunity to review the GSP also. And any other comments or thoughts, questions from y'all? All right. Go ahead. Fort Earl.
Status of the ordinance for the shallow wells. I wasn't able to be at the GA meeting last month.
All right. I think we are finished here on the TAC side. And we will go ahead and turn it over to you, Dave, for a PAC turn.
Thanks, Adam. And I neglected to say, I apologize, that the structure for the public's benefit with the two committees, to make it easy to identify, from myself and to my right are the members of the PAC. Adam and to his left are the members of the TAC. Just so it made it a little more organized for you. And again, we didn't have microphones, fixed microphones for everybody. We thought we had an additional wired microphone. The outlet did not work. So at the PAC table, we have a rotating or a microwave, a remote microphone. And if you'd pass that down to John on your right, let's let John make his first comments. We'll go down the table there. We'll move up to the to Lyle and Lorelei, and then we'll start with Tim Carroll and move back to the center.
One, definitely to follow up with Eddie's. There were some comments the Navy submitted that I've noticed were not acknowledged, and they were very specific actual corrections that need to be made to specific Navy data. So we'll make sure that that is added into the comments on the new one. Also, I was looking at your summary for the Section 6 implementation. I believe your numbers are off for the actual annual costs for Option 1 and Option 2 in comparison to that of the imported water technical memorandum that was provided yesterday. Okay. Those are significant differences, if I'm correct. Okay. So that would make a big difference on also following up on what would be the actual costs to the community. Everything else we'll make sure is put into written comments when we submit next week.
Thank you.
I did actually have a couple questions for clarification, mainly on Section 5. I wanted to know, excluding the transition pool, will the total pumping be 12,000 acre-feet a year at the end of 2021? Is that what the goal is?
The total, what we've called domestic and municipal pumping, should be 12,000. Then on top of that will be whatever's out of the transient pool. So yeah, the total pumping should be around 12,000.
The answer to that question is
yes.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
And then the pumping allocation amount that's going to be decided sometime in 2020, that's given to the individual pumpers, is that allocation amount going to remain the same over the time horizon, excluding any problems with undesirable effects? Is the allocation amount that you're giving at the end of 2020 going to be approximately the same in 2030 for the individual pumpers?
So some of it's going to depend on the success of importing water, and also the ability of pumpers to pay, as was stated. You know, pumping doesn't have to stop if you're willing to pay the augmentation assessment, but that can be a number that's extremely high, and it's hard to understand what uses could afford that other than the district, and so that's yet to be developed. So that's why there is, I wouldn't call it transient, but basically there's a chunk of water that's stored in the basin that the board, to this point anyway, appears that they will support allocating on an equitable basis to the agricultural producers, both large commercial and small commercial agricultural producers. And so the program on top of that, you know, they can either pump that in any amount per year that they want to, or small or large, up to 2040. It's not transferable, but it's an amount of mined water that it's going to be a value judgment, a policy decision on how much, you know, the agency board thinks should be absorbed, and that's pretty much allocated to agriculture. And then the second program, which I think maybe Mr. Decker's right, maybe it's not really fallowing, but it wasn't meant to end up moving title to the property either. It was meant to pay commercial operations not to grow and not to use the water. And it'll be a prescribed period of time over which those payments can be made. So essentially, that's buying back the mining of the basin that would otherwise be allocated. People can still stay there and use the property in another way if they want to keep the property, if they want to ranch, they want to have some place that they want to continue to live in Ridgecrest or in the valley. So that's everybody's individual decision. So if all goes as people think it will, by 2035, I think is Steve's objective, that you'll be sustainable because you hopefully by then will be able to import and afford and have finance, both the capital financing and the operational costs of supplemental water that closes that last 4,000 acre-foot gap. So obviously, that's another amount of mining over a longer period of time that is going to be observed by municipal, industrial, and production. So that's what the intention. So people should understand there is a lot more meat on the bones than people may see, and when they first start reading this, because when this gets set up to DWR, there'll be a process that refines the production numbers that we need to make water allocation decisions, because most of those decisions are going to be based upon pumping during that 5-year period from 2010 to 2014, and it's been a pretty sketchy process to try to get a hold of those production numbers. So that's got to be refined, and then these legal theories and regional use theories would be applied to that. But there's a lot of structure right in front of you. I've looked at a lot of these plans. None of them, at the time they're submitted, give detailed implementation programs with numbers and timelines. We're going to bring in supplemental water. Here's our pipeline project. They all speak in terms of the concept of embarking on these programs, whether it's supplemental water, whether it's buying state project water, buying in one basin, they're buying reclaimed water from an adjacent city's water treatment plant, a sewage treatment plant, in 4,000 acre feet a year. So everything's different, but I haven't seen a plan yet that in detail unfolds the program for supplemental water with critical paths and costs refined. But they will be described enough so that DWR can see you really have a real program that may be viable, and then every 5 years or more often, you have to report to them what's happening with the programs. But this is about allocating production rights. So pretty much there'll be some permanent production rights, but basically the continued production by commercial agriculture is what's represented in that one-time allocation of water that they'll have to mine. That's the approach that's the conceptual approach that is in this plan. It's not trying to hide there. It is in this plan. So
what about the
I'm going to interrupt.
industrial?
We are beyond the TAC portion now. We're in the PAC. You'll have to wait for those comments at another time. Just hang on to it, okay? We'll come back to it.
Okay, I'm not quite finished yet.
Oh.
The augmentation fees, what is the anticipated, in general, augmentation fee amount? When are you guys planning to apply it, and who is going to be paying that?
So I think you can estimate the costs. Okay, that can be estimated. The actual fees would depend on how grant money and other programs that can finance some of this. So I think if somebody throws out a number now and says this is what it's going to cost you per acre foot, that would be kind of a disservice and could be alarming. So that's the reason why there's been an expert or a company hired to try to explore ways of getting some of this financed without throwing it back on the valley, on the ratepayers or the agricultural interests. So I'm not trying to dodge the question. I don't have the numbers anyway, so I'm safe. But I'm not trying to dodge the question.
Well, another way to state it is you have approximately $75 million worth of projects that you want to implement in the first 5 years. And that's a minimum amount of projects. It can go up to, 43 for recycled water, $9 million for fallowing, $23 million for pumping. That doesn't include dust mitigation at $19 million. $75 million is a pretty big number for the first 5 years. Is that realistic? I mean, that's $2,100 for every single person who lives in this valley.
Jim, when you answer, can you make sure you're in the microphone so it's recorded?
Okay. Well, I was going to say the imported water project is not.
That doesn't include imported water.
All right. So
that's all the other ones.
Yeah, those are the costs of the programs that are proposed. As we said, the board has hired Capital Corps, who's already started talking to people about funding options. We've listed them. I think certainly raising that much money is going to depend on some public funding to implement a lot of those projects. When we don't know at this point how much public funding we can get, but that'll be part of the process of implementing the plan.
Thank you.
Tom?
I've got nothing at this time. I have several questions. First of all, I want to say I'm very pleased with what you folks are putting together. You know, it certainly needs to be fleshed out and more, but to me, it has all the right building blocks. It has a firm technical basis. It talks about sustainable management criteria. It has minimum thresholds, and I think I'm pleased with where we're at. I do want to kind of echo the comment that Mallory made that It needs to be a process, and some of the management actions, I think, need to be able to respond or be adjusted over time to findings from, like, for example, the GSP monitoring program, the data gaps you're trying to fix. And I would suggest, say, at every 5-year interval, perhaps preceding the DWR 5-year report, that you revisit the management actions based on how things are progressing, and treat it as a living plan. That's probably the intent, but I think you might do a better job communicating that. And one area particularly of interest to me is the imported water project. I think every 5 years you should take a hard look at the feasibility, what we expect it's going to cost, how much water we might get, if any, and be prepared to adjust the management actions to react to the realities that we're finding for the feasibility of importing water. And along with that, you should be prepared to consider the option, as we're moving forward, that it might not prove feasible, it might prove to be too expensive. And I think if we don't have that element in the plan, even though everybody wants us to succeed, I want us to succeed, it's the highest priority. You've made it very clear in your statement within the GSP, the impact that imported water would have in maintaining our lifestyle. I think if we don't also consider the possibility that it might not be feasible, we may be rejected by DWR. Nobody wants to see us fail at that. Another observation, I was pleased to see what's called the fallowing program. I think we all would like to see some offering to those who may be forced to give up their agriculture activities. And I personally have no problem in paying my share for that. And another, related to that, I'm assuming that the dust mitigation would apply to any farm that stops producing. Is that correct?
That's the intent, yeah.
Okay. And just an observation, looking at what has happened at Owens Lake and the problem that dust has been and the extreme expense that Los Angeles has had to bear. I think that is a nice offering on the part of the Groundwater Authority. That it could be expensive, and if I were a farmer, I'd feel pleased that maybe that gorilla just hopped off of my back. Let's see, I have one other. I think that hits the main points that I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Judy?
Yes, I have some questions and then I have a comment or two. I've read the text twice. I have not looked at the figures or other additions except for the part on the costs that were sent yesterday. My first question is it's to any of you over there. Does DWR have a timeline for response on the GSP?
That's easy. No. There's a lot of skepticism about how fast they can turn around their obligations when they get all these plans submitted to them. I should make another point, though, because the question about cost is fascinating to me, because there's different mechanisms that affect each other. So, for example, if you didn't offer buying the production right, you're giving the commercial agriculture people production right on some kind of hopefully equitable, reasonable basis. And then you're saying, but we want to reduce the cost of the small well program, because the more you let people mine, the more small wells will need attention, and there'll be costs there.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, if you it costs, as you pointed out, $9 million to buy back all the production rights that would stop you from having to do that, and you would get dust control issues because they would. So every one of these factors has an impact on the other, depending on how many of these programs get into the plan. And in this case, agriculture would have a choice on which way to go with that, and we don't know what that'll be. So all these costs don't occur. Some of them offset others, but you raise a good point. It's obviously, it's not cheap, but on the other hand, I don't think Sigma leaves you much choice but to figure out some way to approach this.
Real quick, Judy, on the DWR question too. We expect DWR is going to take a long time. We might get some interim comments back on things that they want to change or add or deficiencies or something like that. We might get something like that back, but we're expecting it's going to take a long time before we all get through the process with DWR. The other thing, and this is I'm not legal, obviously I'm not legal. Maybe Jim can help me with this, but from what I understand, talking to our legal counsels working through the authority, once the authority adopts the GSP, they can move ahead on implementation, things like allocation, while they wait for DWR approval of the plan.
Thank you.
That's what they've said. Okay.
It's not clear in the law.
2 years for review? Probably for review. But I was trying to point out that once the authority board, assuming they do adopt the GSP for submittal, they can move ahead with what's in the plan ahead of that approval by DWR.
Okay, I really caution, there's nothing clear in the statute. Yeah. And so when you go to tell someone you're pumping more than your allocation, so we'll give you a civil remedy or penalty, you get into court says, you don't have a plan. It hasn't been approved by DWR, and even if it is, then it's subject to court review. So I'm not real comfortable telling people that you can enforce immediately while it's under a state review.
Well, actually, that was going to be one of my questions, is who and how is this going to be enforced? Because SGMA has created, by their process and by the JPA process, a government that is allowed to do these things, but they aren't a government of the people because it was not created by the people, nor can the people voluntarily be elected to it. They are, in fact, elected to other positions. That is, you have a water district representative, a city representative, 3 county representatives. They were all elected to their position for which they are serving on. They were not elected to the GA board by the population. And I believe that presents not only a problem, it presents a conflict of interest as well.
As I said, I read a brief that went on about that point for about 15 pages.
Jim, can you answer in the microphone, please?
No, well, Judy's point has been made in the Las Posas Basin lawsuit. By the way, there's a SGMA plan and an adjudication going parallel to each other at the same time there. And somebody submitted, in fact, I'd be happy to send you a copy, a gratuitous 15-page slam on the conflicts of interest that were generated. In that case, it's Fox Canyon Water Agency, which is not a group of different, but they are not elected. They are also populated by people from other agencies who are elected to those other agencies. And so is, by the way, every county sanitation district in California, all of which have tremendous powers to assess and reclaim water and spread water in basins. So there's a lot of examples of what you're talking about that are actively going on in California.
Yes, and there's a lot of problems too. But my question is, okay, so the GA adopts this plan or a similar version of it. How are they going to enforce it?
I think those are going to be good questions for the workshop. For the board.
Okay, well, but you're writing the plan, and I presume that you have conferred with the board in writing the plan. And the part I brought up about the board not being a government like the Water District Board or City Council, they don't have a staff to go with it either. Which brings up another question, and this question is, how sure are you that you have identified all of the pumpers? I know you know who the big pumpers are. I know you know who the small agricultural pumpers are, for the most part, who have come forward. But there are other pumpers. There are mutuals. There are many, many co-ops. There are the private wells. You have in your document put down, in one place you put down 897, if I did my arithmetic right. In another place you put down 872 de minimis pumpers. How do you know for sure that you have all those pumpers identified and identified correctly? Because when this plan is adopted, or another version of some version of it, they're now going to have the ability, I presume, to do the things that they have outlined in the plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you answer my question?
I'll try, Judy. You're asking, do we know we have all of the wells? The answer is no. That's been a question that's been in front of the board. That's been a question we've been asked from the beginning. When is the effort to actually go out and make sure you've got all the wells? And that's been a concern. I know some of the big ag people have asked, have you got all the other pumpers? Because they're paying and other people maybe not. So there's been a real effort to do it. The path that the authority chose to try and identify pumpers, there's been a lot of criticism about that method. The next step that they're talking about doing, I'll just let you know where the board is going on this, and this is the board. Again, it's not us, it's the board making this decision. But the next step the board is talking about doing is having a show cause type hearing process where the board has people come in and bring information on their pumping to the board for the ultimate allocation process. They're talking about doing that in 2020. I don't know that that's going to be effective. It doesn't answer your question about how do you know you've got them all. It doesn't answer your question about how do you enforce it. It doesn't answer any of those questions.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think.
I agree with Wade and some of the other TAC members who made comments about the cost. I don't know if you have the time before you submit this, but perhaps afterwards, I think you need to have a column on one of your tables that shows not just the cost, but the value of a project. For instance, if you spend so much money on a water project and it only is going to serve or relieve a small amount of the overdraft, the board needs to see that so they can evaluate which project they deem to be the most worthwhile for the money.
Yeah, it would be like a cost benefit. We'd do a
Yes,
cost benefit on
thank
it.
you.
Yes, you're welcome.
And I too have a comment like Don's, is there are many small errors in your document. I know we have spell check and grammar check and those kinds of things on our computer, but you need to go through it and correct the inconsistencies. In some places you say the overdraft started in the 1950s, in some places you say it started in the 1960s. That's an example. Those inconsistencies need to be fixed for a reason, not just because they need to be fixed because they're inconsistencies. This is the GA Board's plan. And the public is going to read it, and if they see inconsistencies, they're going to take a negative view of the plan. I mean, they're going to already, all right? But they're really going to take a negative view of the validity of it. And Don is always saying to me, who I'm a pretty casual person, he'll tell you, the devil is in the details. And it certainly is in this plan. And that leads me to my last comment. On page 3, you say, and I'll quote you, you say water producers have been forced to mine the basin in order to meet water demand. We have been here for over 50 years. This is the first time the governing agencies in this valley have gotten together to discuss the issue of our 50-year, 60-year overdraft. I would like you to change the word forced to something else, because it is not a true statement. Thank you.
Lyle. Yes, I'm here. Okay. First, I would like to commend Stetson for the stellar job. A couple of months ago when Steve Johnson said, we're going to have you a draft by the 4th of November. I go, whoa, that's kind of optimistic, I think. And then Monday afternoon, I have seen nothing in my mailbox. And I'm going, whoa, man, how's this working? And then at 1908, showing up in my mailbox was a thing from Heather Steele. My wife pointed it out to me, and I went, oh, my gosh, that's it. And so, yeah, you did it. You followed through, so it's stellar. Obviously, Heather put in a lot of midnight oil getting that thing done. Didn't know she was sick, too. I did not, like Don and Judy, I have not read all of it. I leafed through a lot of it. I spent most of my time in sections 4 and 5 because those I hadn't seen too much of, and 6. And I will echo what Judy says. There's some typos in it. I'll submit those in writing. A number of typos I found in section 5. So let's see, what else did I have? And Don's clarification on the section 5 that it's really just an outline of the plan. The implementation plan is going to have the hard stuff in it. So I understood that. I understood that going in. So, okay, I think that's about it. Go ahead,
Orla.
Thank you. So I want to address two things, and I will be submitting some written comments on one of them. But I wanted to point out that the California Environmental Quality Act, which I am the designated expert for the County of Kern for over 40 years of experience, the legislature only gave this board an exemption for the plan itself at a very high level. And that exemption does not extend to the kinds of details that you're looking for. For example, coming up with evaluation criteria and impacts on shallow wells, there is a very thin line that this board is walking. That's why it is at such a high level. You have to do a mitigated neg deck or an environmental impact report. That's a 6-month to 14-month. That could range up to a lot of money and another public process. So they are walking a thin line here. The legislature did give them an exemption for the GSP, which was brilliant, but it does not go and cover a lot of the details that you're looking for. So that is why they're kind of doing the best they can, and I think it's interesting. I think they've done a pretty good job of trying to walk that line. The comment that I will put in writing is that over in the Central Valley portion, where we have another GSP, the Department of Water Resources, Department of Fish and Wildlife, environmental groups, and now they've included the county. We are working on taking that land, and if it turns to habitat, there could be payments for that. The Mojave ground squirrel area extends over the entire area that is mostly the unincorporated areas where people may not have water. And so I would like to see, I have a couple of paragraphs that you could put in the plan. I can assure you that DWR is going to be looking for this. And this would provide a way to monetize that land if they then also sold off their water. So it would be a duplicate. And there would be some agreements on what you do with that land to enhance the habitat. It's very exciting, and it's another opportunity for these property owners to monetize their land. So I'll be putting that in writing, so hopefully we can get it in one of these chapters.
Tim?
No comment right now.
Yes, I wanted to thank Stetson for getting our plan out so we can discuss it. I think it's a great feat to get it done on time, and it gives us something to really work at. It does remind me of when I worked for Rockwell on the space shuttle. There was never enough time to do it right, but after you got Congress to fund us, there was enough time to do it over. So, I still have a problem with how is the food on your plate more important than your domestic water. And if I'm willing to ramp down 3/4 or more to help achieve sustainability, why am I forced to go out of business after a certain amount of water that I pump in this pool is exhausted?
Renee?
I want to say thank you for getting the plan together. I have some questions. On like slide 18 for section 4, sustainable management criteria, you mentioned there were 11 wells selected as representative monitoring wells sites, but that sustainable management criteria established only at 6 representative wells. So does that mean the other 5 wells are sort of like going to be monitored for future data? Is that what that means?
That's right. We selected those wells because we think they're in locations where we do want to set some criteria, but there's not enough data on them. So going forward, well, actually, there was at least an attempt to get data from them recently. And the plan is we would get data going forward, collect data over maybe 3 years, and use that data to then set criteria for those wells.
Okay. And then I just need some explanation of some acronyms that are used on slide 21 and slide 22, where the acronym SNORT, what does that stand for?
Supersonic Naval Ordnance Research Track, SNORT.
Okay.
It's a very sensitive piece of equipment. It's the reason why we're worried about the settlement.
Okay.
It's a 4-mile-long continuous rail track for accelerating things well above the speed of sound several times.
Okay. Is DWR familiar with that acronym? Are you going to put some kind of note of explanation for them? Okay, that's because I'm looking at this as a layperson. Okay, then the other thing, GDE, on slide 22, what does that stand for?
Groundwater dependent ecosystems.
Those are some of like the vegetation, groundwater dependent systems that depend on shallow groundwater.
Okay.
You want to dry those out.
Okay.
Every business has its jargon or acronyms. Obviously, most of those were related to the TAC.
Okay. Slide 23. When you listed the annual pumping allocation program will assign each qualified groundwater pumper an annual pumping allocation of the safe yield, if any, after consideration of, and then it lists federal water reserve rights, California water rights, beneficial use priorities, historical groundwater production, municipal requirements for health and safety. Are these listed in an order of priority from most important to least priority, or are they just randomly listed?
It's not random, but the only priority you can rely on, and even that's subject to some question in this valley, is the Federal Reserve right. Federal Reserve right is pretty much from the date the military reservation was established, was something around 1943 or 4. That any pumping after that is subjected to a priority of the federal military base. But there's a claim of prior pumping by one of the pumpers that may have preserved some older water right. The rest of them, when we're talking about California water rights, we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about overlying rights. We're talking about appropriative rights by the water district and others, and we're talking about prescriptive rights, self-help rights, but most of all, and I appreciate what was just said before by the gentleman before you. We're talking about the application of a reasonable use doctrine in a basin that can only pump, in the end, 1/4 of what it's pumping, and the rest has to be imported to sustain permanent uses. And who can afford that? And that's what it's boiling down to. And so we've been brilliantly argued to about both sides of that equation. Well, some people don't think there should be any agricultural production in a basin that doesn't have enough to go around to sustain the community that sustains the naval base and the people in that community. So there's nothing certain about that priority of water rights when you apply the reasonable use doctrine to it, except for the Federal Reserve rights.
Okay. Then Mr. Markman, I still have some other questions for you.
Okay.
Let's see. When you talked about the deadlines.
Yes.
Okay. If this plan doesn't meet everything, and what happens? Do they send it back to you and say you need to work this section over? And then do you get like 30 days to
I hope more
adjust it, or is it 90 days?
Well, they're going to tell you probably as you go along. They'll be sending messages, but you can reach a state where you're put in probation because you haven't responded to the comments. You do get a chance to fix everything unless they just say right to the core of this, it's not meeting the criteria for sustainable management, and you haven't defined the goals. If they do something structural like that, you'd have to start over and get a probationary period to do it. But there's no 30 days or 10 days or 4 months or 6 months sitting there staring you in the face as a second deadline. So it's uncertain when or if DWR ever will say, okay, we're done with you. This is going to the State Water Resources Control Board. They'll write their plan for you. I can't tell you how long you would be dealing with them to try to fix problems before something like that happened. But I will say that this basin is in a state of overdraft multiple times the amount pumped over safe yield that is pretty stressed compared to anything else I've seen. The only one I've seen like this with these kind of numbers is Borrego. And I've read they've submitted a plan. It doesn't have any specific implementation. But they're they're equally in a fix like that.
Okay. Then I have another question.
Okay.
And this is separate than the proposed, buyback of the pool amount, the agriculture people are.
Yes. Right.
Okay, this is separate from that, but it's related. Who is eligible to purchase water rights in the Indian Wells Valley? Is it the Groundwater Authority only, or can other government agencies? Yes. What happens in other parts of the state?
Well, I think that's an open question on that program, because you can allocate pumping rights and say you can't transfer them, but you have 40 years to use that much water. And then there's got to be a period where you decide not to do it, and so you protect the shallow wells and you cut out the mining. But who's going to fund that is still an open question. The agency, I think, could fund it. But then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, what's its funding source? Is it coming from some other government grant? Is it coming from assessments that it's going to levy on per acre foot of production? Those decisions haven't been made. Exploring how you fund this and who funds it is an open question.
Like in other parts of California, are there other water?
Well, I mean, the water district could do a program like they have the power to do a program like this, for example.
That's what I mean.
I'm pretty sure the agents and the GSA has the power to do this, or the authority, and then probably the city. If you want to scour the rights of a general law city like that, they probably have the authority too. But the question is, who's going to, what funding source and which agency is going to do the physical program? This is like a good example. This is Chino Basin adjudication that has these massive, expensive programs for big desalters and the sale of the product water from the desalters. And although the water master and all the pumpers put that together, the actual physical programs were done by other specific public agencies, usually IEUA, which is the big sewering agency. So you look for public entities that have the powers, and in this basin it's pretty clear who does, and it's this authority and two other public entities. And I'm sure the Navy could find the power too, but I haven't seen the Navy. They've been very cooperative, but I don't know that anyone's thought of trying to ask them for that kind of help.
Okay, thank you.
Nick.
At the last GA meeting, we got a commitment that the complete plan would be out by November 4. I got very excited about that. Lyle, like you apparently, when I heard your story, I was chuckling inside. I waited till about 10 a.m. on Monday before I checked the internet. Nothing. 11, 12. On the hour, I was checking. And about 7 o'clock, I said, oh, man, it ain't going to happen. And I'm usually to bed pretty early, but I gave it one more check at 10 after 7. And my time was identical to yours. At 7:08, it was there. And I got pretty jacked up. I knew I wasn't going to sleep, and I made no effort to sleep that night. I did something I hadn't done since the early 1960s. I pulled an all-nighter. And I did get through in detail sections 4, 5, and 6. And I made up my comments over that period, and later in the afternoon on Tuesday, I sent those off to Heather Steele. She had asked for direct input from us as we completed our views. She said she preferred that we not wait until the 15th, and as we finished chapter, sent it in. So I took that to heart, and I typed it up, and each of you at the dais, the TAC and the PAC, and the public, I left several copies on the table out there. If they're gone or you didn't get one, I have a few extra up here. But they will serve as my questions and comments to deal with as you may choose. I would like to confirm that, in fact, Heather and Stetson would continue to prefer to get our comments as we complete chapters rather than wait until the 15th through Chairman Janus.
Now that's a last deadline as to when they're due. Send them to us when you're ready. If you have them all tomorrow, do so.
Well, us being you and as I have done to Heather.
Just make sure that you do not do unilateral and only communication with Stetson or Heather. Heather is the preferred delivery to keep your inbox from all the other things that you have. But we need it to coordinate across the committee and with the GA itself, staff, to ensure that they are posted, that we've got them all, and that everybody else is going to get the viewing, both members of the committee and the public.
It's a double check to send it to both of us at the same time. It goes through the committees, so it gets posted. Heather gets it so she can work on it. While you were talking about that, I got a text from Heather that said, tell them I want them when they're ready. Don't wait for come from the committee, because she said I need to work on them when they're ready. So
no, and that's never been the PAC process.
Right.
It's send them in, we'll get them to you. And in this case, you can imagine with the deadline, Heather's under. And I was going to make my comments at the end, a comment at the end. Everyone in here, get your comments to Heather and to Adam and I as soon as you can. I know we all like to work under deadlines. The earlier you get it in, the easier it is for them to make a deadline and to be able to consider your comments properly.
Dave, that is why I did copy you on this. You've kind of suggested, I think, that if I was to have additional comments, not only would they go straight to Heather and you, but possibly Adam also, or no?
Just the respective committee chairs, and then they'll eventually get posted on the website so the public sees all of them.
Okay. One final comment. When I transmitted this piece to Heather, I put a personal note in my email complimenting her and her gang at Stetson for the quality job they have done. One, Lyle, as you say, in meeting their commitment. Literally, my juices were flowing all night. I was so looking forward to getting into this. And appreciating the cleanup that had been done. Someone had commented on the efforts that had been made. I had no problem reading or understanding it. I found it to correlate beautifully with the slides that have been here tonight. So I did want you to know that I, like Mr. Katzenstein, is pretty pleased with the overall product you've come up with, and especially appreciate the incredible Herculean effort that has been put in by all of you and your staff. So thank you for that.
Josh?
Okay, I've got a number of questions, and I apologize because they're both, I would call them technical and legal kind of mixed together, so sorry for the musical chairs on answering them. Has there been an extension of the Federal Reserve right to this extent? Has it been court tested before to say it's not just for the use of the Navy but for a federal entity's off-base use? And what's the Navy's position on the Groundwater Authority relying on their legal claim?
There has not been a case deciding that issue either way. So it's an open issue.
New ground.
Sort of new ground. I can tell you personal experience on off reservation use claims. I've run into that extensively and briefed it in federal court in a dispute in Anza between a Cahuilla Indian tribe and about 400 residents I represent who all are small well owners. And the tribes claim that they want to monetize their water right. You know, you get the water right based on how much row crops you can grow and what the water demand would be. The Winters case, which was the Colorado River case. So they get a big number, and then now they want to sell it down the hill and build a pipeline. And our argument was you can't do that because you're base confined, or at least you're confined to supporting the beneficial use of the base with the water. So we briefed that, and the federal magistrate refused to decide it, thought it was a close question, and went on trying to make us negotiate. But so that's a real open question. The difference here is the Navy isn't trying to monetize or peddle off the base water that they can sell to somebody else who would pay for it. The theory here is the base can't operate without the personnel who are living in the community to which the water is served, so that serves the purpose of the base, at least to some calculable amount. But the answer to your question is no, I can't cite you a case, and neither can my buddy Scott Slater cite you a case that has decided that specific question one way or the other.
Okay. Since you're already up there, I guess I'll try to get the legal ones in a row if I can. So inside the document, the draft plan, there's a section where it says that these water rights will be, that there's going to be a distinction between water rights for those who have used water since the IWV GB has been documented to be in overdraft condition, and then it's kind of a before and after point. So is that, again, to that nebulous point of at some point in the past we entered in overdraft conditions, but since there's been no... So, like, I guess the question is, when is the prescriptive period that the GA is using?
It moves. The prescriptive period, you can find an historic prescriptive period, and then if you have continuous use, let's say you get a water right, which is the lowest amount you use for the 5-year prescriptive period, and you never dive lower than that use for another 5 years as you take it forward, then that'll establish, that's how you track that prescriptive right. I mean, we're not going to look at that. We're looking at 2010 to 2014 to look at production, because that's the period of time. That's 5 years, and within that 5-year period of time, if you're doing self-help rights because there's prescription, you get the amount you continuously pump for 5 years. So, and we can back that up all from the way the overdraft started and track somebody forward. So I say when that hasn't been done, so I'm not comfortable with the database now where conclusions are being made, and that's one thing we're going to try to improve over the next 3 or 4 months. The production data is just what we asked people, what is it? People gave it to us. No verification, no tracking, and a lot of small producers not identified. So,
okay.
So I will say this, though. Well, we know Searles has made it public, so they claim a pre-naval reservation right, because they pumped appropriately. They exported water to Trona, or their predecessor did to some extent, they claim, prior to the date the Navy reservation was established by I think it was a presidential order or act of Congress. So they're claiming, and this is, I don't know a case that really deals with this either, so they're claiming, well, we get the first X acre feet because the Navy is paramount to everybody else, but we're paramount to them because of the historic date we started pumping, and so what do we do about that when we compare them to other pumpers and take the Navy out of the middle? So there's a lot of really fascinating and interesting water rights calcs that go into this basin.
And just a follow-up question to that, the 2010 to 2014 period, was that mandated through SGMA, or is that an application of prescriptive law that we're using?
No, it's sort of mandated from SGMA because SGMA has a provision that says pumping from January 1st, 2015 forward cannot be included in your calculation.
Right, but SGMA doesn't say that if you didn't pump from 2010 to 2014, you're not allowed to have a... That part is being done by our board.
No, the pumping between 2010 through 2014 is in play.
Right, but that's a decision based on our board's decisions, not based on the laws of SGMA, or the text of the legislation.
Well, I can't go forward from that date and say, well, you pump more since SGMA.
Right, but I'm saying instead of using
I
2000...
I can't go backwards, and we can. It's a 5-year period.
And that 5-year period's in the SGMA law.
That's just in common law in California.
Okay, so we're taking common law.
Yeah, that's a prescriptive period. So we can back it up, and somebody might have a higher right theoretically based on what they pumped before 2010. But so we don't think that applies to...
But that's an arbitrary decision made by our board, not that 5-year period. The actual 5 years chosen were a decision made by our board, not mandated by SGMA.
Well, I won't say it's the board. I think we conferred with Stetson, and legally and technically, looking at the few producers we're concerned about who might have a self-help or prescriptive right. We know who that is, and if one of them represented we had a bigger pumping right higher than our lowest year in that 2010 to 2014 period, we listened to that.
Okay.
If you've got that, we'll listen to that. If somebody can show us that's the case, we haven't heard that yet.
Okay, I think one or two more for you, if that's okay. What's the difference between the taking of a water right and not allowing someone to fully utilize their water right as a result of an administrative action?
Well, if somebody's going to take your water right, you mean?
Well, so I know
preclude you from pumping a certain
Yeah, so I know
amount
SGMA doesn't affect water rights, which is that sentence.
Okay, well,
that you
let me
said.
say what I said about it at the start.
Right.
I don't believe that.
Right.
Because in SGMA, you can allocate the amount everybody can pump in a given year, and it's not a final decision because it's subject to DWR review and court review. So if somebody thinks you calculated this contrary to California common law, this board's decision is not final on that. But they still make the final administrative decision subject to DWR review. So I don't quite, that language I think confuses more than it clarifies anything.
Okay. I think the rest of them are probably both technical and legal, so I don't know if they're going to be
I'll stand
who will
by.
answer.
Hopefully
So, okay.
Jeff can do that.
So I guess the question is, I was excited to see the plan, but in my mind, all the key things that are going to help us determine how to plan our operations aren't in there. So if you look at section the scenario 6.1, which is what's most informing, the ag pool, municipal on that one was like 63 or 4,000 acre feet. So the transient pool's now been reduced to 51,000 acre feet. So if I just apply some common man logic, Mojave Pistachio's got 4,000 acre feet out of that 64,000. So I would assume that out of the 51,000 in the transient pool, we're going to get about 3,500 or so if you proportionally reduce it. So that gives us enough water to operate for about 6 to 8 months. So we've mentioned here multiple times that we don't have the data, we don't have the details, we're still fleshing out the plan, we're still trying to figure out what we're doing exactly. And yet, based off of all the past data I've seen, it's highly likely that come June 2020, we're going to be given 6 to 8 months to operate until we have to start paying a replenishment fee, which we don't know yet. But in the past, I've seen data that you guys had it at $2,000 to $4,000 per acre foot, depending on which of the two plans go through. So in my mind, it's difficult. I guess this is both a question and a comment. The question is, when are we going to see the allocated rights and the transient pool rights? And then the question is, if someone like Mojave Pistachios is expected to be put out of business within 8 months after June 2020, how can we expect to have any type of, pistachios are a long crop. We do pruning now that costs a lot of money that takes 10 years to see the benefit of. So we would farm our operations differently if we knew when we were going to be put out of business by you guys. So I guess that's my question, is when are we going to find out, how long we have to operate?
I was going to go back to your first question. I think it was a question. There was an assumption in there, too, that there's a different number for the transient pool than what was seen in modeling scenario 6.2. And the intent isn't that everyone will be proportionately reduced based on that. That number comes out of the allocation table that was distributed to the PAC and TAC at their last meetings, which was, developed well after the modeling scenario 6.2 was done. And the lower transient pool number is a result of removing Searles Valley from the allocation plan because they're getting an allocation under that table that was distributed there. And the GSP says up to the amount that's listed there. I think it's 51,000 feet. And I recognize the uncertainty that does remain from a business perspective in the plan. I will say it's the most detailed allocation plan I've seen in any GSP that's been released so far. As Lorelei pointed out, we can only go so far in the plan. The board has to make a determination of the allocations. There's going to be a process to do that, as was mentioned, for people to bring information forward. At this point, that table that was distributed is based on the information that's available that we know isn't complete. Is some of the thoughts on what an allocation might look like, but there'll be a whole process to lay that out, and the intent that's laid out in the plan is to do that as soon as we can.
Yeah, and I'll just make the comment that we're in a lot of GSAs over in the other part of Kern County, Tulare County, and Fresno County, and a lot of them, it's very true, they are very high level, just like this one, and they also do not have the details just like this one, probably for the very reasons you just mentioned. But most of them also had not suggested earlier that they're going to be putting people out of business within 12 months of implementation. So that's the other difference. Most of them start having drastic draconian cuts in 2040 as the law requires. Another question. So Project 6 seems like after you've kicked out agriculture from the Northwest region, you're now going to go in there and put some new wells in and then make up for the overpumping of the Southwest well field over time by pumping in the Northwest region. So more of a comment than a question. It just hurts to hear that we're going to be kicked out of a region and then you're going to go back to that region to pump it to make up for deficiencies in other areas. So that hurts. Another question, how can we allocate $325 million roughly for potential imported water projects and only allocate $9 million to basically locally develop water through a fallowing program? If you talk about fallowing all the agricultural acreage, about 3,000 or so acres roughly, that's $3,000 an acre. And I can tell you that, being almost $20,000 an acre into our ground in Mojave pistachios, that's not a viable option. Those are comments, and I'll get back to I've got about 3 more questions, and I promise I'm done. So does the groundwater-dependent ecosystems apply to the endangered Mojave Tui chub on the base? Is that considered a groundwater-dependent ecosystem?
That's a good question.
There's actually a case on that. There's actually a case that the first time that the public trust doctrine was applied in a groundwater adjudication was Mojave, which I tried. And that was the first time water was allocated to the riparian environment in the Baja or lower section of the river so the Tui chub could continue to survive. So I would say the answer is yes.
Okay, so we do have a GDE that we need to consider on the base.
You do, although we've all talked about maybe moving the little fellows down to the part of the Mojave River that's already being protected for them. But, that there's a lot of people you have to deal with who have to approve that.
Right. Okay, so kind of my last 2 ones. So how much is the replenishment fee? I know that we've talked before. You guys don't have a number. I understand that. And if the fee's economically prohibitive to taking out agriculture, how is that different than just taking agriculture? So in my mind, that's like kind of saying that we're going to take everyone's Camry and we're going to give you a Porsche. You just have to be able to buy the Porsche. Yeah. So having a replenishment fee out there as if it's $4,000 an acre, that's economically prohibitive to anybody except a municipal user, and even then it's going to cost a municipal user a lot to afford that water. So in my mind, if you engineer a system where you just make the water so prohibitively expensive, that's the same as saying someone can't pump.
Okay. So that's really not an engineering question or answer. The answer is you're making a great argument for the reason why when you think of reasonable beneficial use, in an overdrafted basin that's pumping 3 to 4 times the amount of available water. And in 2040, it's not true you can overdraft till 2040. It means that's the last date you have to be sustainable at or before that date. So if this continuation of commercial agriculture for these reasons can't afford even a proportionate share of the supplemental water, for me, you're just making an argument why it shouldn't survive reasonably and beneficially, because these other uses where you have a base to spread the cost can absorb it. And we can't not get sustainable at some point in time. And that 4,000 acre feet over and above anything agriculture could pump still has to be afforded if Searles and the present level of municipal pumping is to survive. So if your argument is we make commercial agriculture survive, I don't think you want us to say, well, we won't even give you the opportunity to pay whatever the costs are. We don't know the costs. We don't know. All we know is we're trying to find 4,000 acre feet of water at the most efficient and inexpensive way we can. And the one that we've talked about, the two were flashed up on the board. One is way cheaper than the other, but it's still a lot of money. So if ag can't afford it and we have to have 7,600 feet of production of local water, and that's all, then where does that leave us? The Navy has a reserve right. The Navy could expand its use and expand the reserve right. They at one point pumped 9,000 acre feet a year on the base. So they have all kinds of arguments. By the way, anything I'm saying about the Federal Reserve right is not, I'm not speaking for the Navy. The Navy has their own points of view and their own lawyers, and they will assert what they want to in this process. But I'm just commenting. It's a horrible situation. Nobody wants to see anybody blown out, so to speak. But on the other hand, we're going to get to that 7,650 of pumping local water one way or the other, and then the rest has to be imported at those expenses, those costs. So I get what you're saying, and I understand why you're saying it, but I don't think it supports. I mean, I don't know who's to support imported water that ag would use other than ag, and if it's too much, I mean, that sort of speaks for itself. If it's way too much, it speaks for itself. So that's just my reaction. I'm not trying to advocate against. I understand your position.
Okay. And then the last two, they're kind of more, I guess, technical questions is, which well is in R2? Is that Neil Ranch 2?
Yes.
Not a big deal, but we were never approached about having one of the wells on our fields be used as a long-term monitoring well for a program that's designed to kick us out. So I looked through the agreement whenever we sold the property, and we agreed to allow the Indian Wells Valley Water District or the Kern County Water Agency to make 2 annual water readings. And so it's just weird to see a plan, and you're reading through it, and you look up NR2, and you realize that's a well on one of your own fields that's going to be used to try to monitor you out of existence. So that was just to point out also that as part of that same agreement, there's an agreement that the Indian Wells Valley Water District will not pump north of Highway 178 for 25 years. And so that pumping optimization program, I assume you would also be talking to us about that as well, because that seems that it would require some help from us as well. So, appreciate all the hard work you guys have done. I especially appreciate having Markman and both of you gentlemen here to answer our questions. But this plan just generated as many questions, controversies, and potential, I hate to use the L word, but litigation issues as it helps answer. So, thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Josh. I'll offer some comments before we close this section with a last bite at the pill. I, too, echo the compliments to Stetson, your team, the staff, as it in its entirety, since there were others involved from the legal side, obviously, and not just Jim. And most of the attorneys for the pumpers in this room were present as part of that also. And Heather, if you're watching, we were all pleased. I take note of the time that Lyle and Nick quoted, I thought I had a pretty slow ISP provider. It's the first time I was 1 minute faster than you guys in receiving that. So It's interesting that all of us were checking that eagerly to see when the awaited document, and there have been many statements in this room from folks previously that they highly doubted the ability of Stetson to deliver that on time. So kudos to you. I also echo comments from a couple others. West, I think, brought up one related to, notwithstanding Lorelei's valid, absolutely correct points about the detail we are allowed to have in there, that with regards to goals at updates in getting further level refinement or answers, that those are assurances that would help the public understand and have an idea a little bit more of what the plan is. And to that end, one of those things, I'll use a different word, would be the off-ramp. If we did not get to the point where we had no more chance to obtain imported water, what was our plan? When do we have to make that decision in order to be implementing that plan? So off-ramps and options, and some of those are a little bit more cost refinements also that go into the same basket. There are many opportunities, not that we can get them all, for grants. Not all of them are what Capital Corps is looking for, and there are other groups like the one that I am connected with that are out there working advocacy on grants. And perhaps when we do get to the point where we have a refinement of costs and try to put it into the language that a user out here, take it for example, the water district, which has the largest number of users in the valley, is what might be the impact of their rates. That could be given the options if we achieve this much in grant funds, what do they then have to bear? So that is a cost benefit form also on the other side that would inform the GA as decision makers on which tasks and the public as to when we might, what the ranges are and when we might have an idea of narrowing those ranges. I think number two, the question that was brought up with regards to snort and settling at their subsidence is the word I was looking for. Obviously, as you said, Stefan, if the Navy, that's the Navy's track that has to be level at those speeds. If the Navy saw subsidence there, you know darn well the Navy's going to do something about it. However, it brought up the thought in my mind, the Navy has partnership agreements while still maintaining their sovereign, that's the wrong word, but their superseding rights for operations, et cetera, in some areas. Is there wording, John and Stefan, that could be captured in the document with regards to, because the Navy is such a big part of the basin, there's a cooperative approach to solving these problems as we go down the path with the GSP, with all the legal disclaimers that might be in it. Something for you guys to think about and maybe run by legal that would give perhaps the public and others a little bit more assurance about the partnership the partnership relationship. Yeah, but I know there's going to be a lot of caveats on that, but still the Navy does a lot of great partnership. The reason we have a petroglyph festival is because the Navy's protected those petroglyphs. No other petroglyphs in North America have been protected like that. There are many, many other examples. John could cite you line and verse where there are partnerships the Navy has where they retain their rights but do collaboration. And so if there's common language somewhere, it might be good to think about adding it to the GSP, if able, at some point now or downstream. Just a thought. You think it covers what I just talked about? Okay.
I've seen it. We'll look at it.
Thanks. Okay, so there is something that sort of addresses that. Okay. That was my point. Sorry, I rambled a little bit. I have not had the opportunity to read it all since I had some other serious commitments this week. In skimming, I don't know that I saw desal mentioned and some of the things that are being worked there. Was it a subtopic under something else, or is it something that should be in there?
You're referring to ocean desal?
No, desal of brackish water.
Well, the brackish water study, there's a section right about projects that are additionally being studied
Right, but we're not, what level of that are we incorporating in this GSP? As I said, I didn't get into the details.
It's at the end of the projects and management actions as studies that are ongoing and will be considered as they're developed.
Okay.
Whether they're
So it's in there.
as part
I
of the
just wanted to
solution.
be
Yep,
sure it was.
You bet.
Okay.
You bet. The brackish water group provided us with text. We didn't quite use it all, but we did include it.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'd like to offer, Adam and I talked a moment ago, I'd like to offer one last bite at the apple to both PAC and TAC members. If you have, I'm sorry, Don, you were sitting at the other table without a microphone and I just skipped you. No insult intended.
Yeah, I know I'm at the kiddie table here, but I did want to make just one comment. I did want to echo what others have said about the effort that Stetson put into putting this together. I know firsthand the effort that you went through, and all that Heather did in particular. And I don't have any real comments at this time. I do want to say that when we look at this plan, there are a lot of projects in there. Not all of them have dollar amounts assigned to them, but I think we know that the costs are going to be significant. And as a result of that, we know that water is going to be more expensive as time goes on. And as the water district, we understand that some of those costs are going to be passed on to the water district and our customers. And I just want to say that our board is sensitive to that. And again, I'm not going to make any comments tonight, but the board of directors is meeting on Tuesday night, and this is going to be a topic of discussion. And we want to make sure that any comments that Tim or I provide are framed within the direction that our board wants those comments. So we want to make sure we're all aligned. And so, again, no comments tonight, but great job on what you did, and we'll certainly be submitting some comments.
Thanks, Don. Assuming I haven't slighted anybody else, we wanted to offer one last bite at the apple from either committee members on questions that really require tonight clarification or better understanding before we go to the public. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, Stephen. Go ahead.
A few comments, if I could. I'll try to make it quick. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming to my going away party. This will be my last TAC as I'm retiring from the Navy in December.
Did you buy the keg?
I noticed there's no cake and there's way too little beer. Steve, what is up with that? It's pretty entertaining, though. Everyone, I'll pile on with everybody else in acknowledging Stetson. Obviously, Heather and Jeff and even Steve have put a lot of work into this stuff. I, in particular, though, work a lot with Gene and Nicole in filling data gaps and on the base, and they really care about doing the work, doing a good job, and it shows. So, just want to acknowledge those guys, great people, Steve. Finally, I did want to just mention, I often get thanks for helping out with both the GA, the TAC, and brackish water people, and I enjoy it. It's great. I'll do this.
And CASGEM.
And CASGEM and KCWA, yeah. I would do this all week long if I could, if I didn't have that day job. But I just want to point out that this wouldn't happen without the approval and the willingness of my command, my local command, in particular Commander Benson now and Captain Dale, to expend the resources and the support for this community effort. So, I think it's just in my opinion, they do kind of far beyond what is the minimum required to make things happen. So anyway, I wanted to thank the Navy and the GA for letting me help on this project. I sincerely wish you all success in an effective and as fair as possible plan in the future. So good luck with everything.
Thanks, Stephen, and fair winds and following seas.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, going back to where we were, any last comment from PAC or TAC member, Don?
The question actually was a comment that I was going to make earlier. In reading through, I think the details of the Searles Valley Minerals location, the management actions connected with them is incomplete, of course, and not very clear. And I don't want to go into any detail here at all, but I think you guys ought to take a closer look at what you say in your document about how they're going to fit in.
Okay, with that, let's go to public comment on this item, the GSP draft itself and or the presentation.
Good evening. I'm Elaine Mead. I just have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll ask the easy one first. In scenario 6.2, there was a statement that said there was a growth factor of 1% of the water district's demand. And I was wondering, is that growth factor still in the plan? I didn't see it anywhere.
There's a discussion of growth that is in some of the land use planning documents. The plan doesn't propose to regulate growth, but modeling scenario 6.2, which did have the 1% growth, was used as the basis for some of the sustainability criteria. So in that sense, there's growth included in the plan.
But not specifically stated.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And this one I think will be for Mr. Markman. In Section 5, the third paragraph, it says that this is concerning the following program. Can you explain the GA's definition of fair market value, and what is that value being placed on?
Well, I did not compute that. And I don't
okay, maybe
Can you come on up to the microphone before answering that one, please? Thank you.
I'll try and answer. What's I think stated or intended in the document is that it would be the fair market value of the land. And Mr. Markman's comment about the value, there was an appraisal number, and the expenses are estimated expenses. There'd have to be a process for determining what would be paid for the fallowing, but we used an appraised land appraisal number that was available to get an idea of what fallowing might cost.
Okay, then so you're looking at fair market value of the land. Okay. How will that fair market value be arrived at? Would that?
Well, we say the management action number one, there's going to be a process to flesh out all those details. I would assume it would be if it's based on fair market value of the land, there would need to be appraisal on that.
Okay. If it is based on appraisals, who and how are the appraisers chosen? Who chooses them? And
I'm trying to answer this. There are no answers to this.
What?
Because nobody is. This is a voluntary program.
I understand
Nobody
that.
is forcing a condemnation of property or preclusion of pumping the water. So how much that is worth in a market where people will actually do that as a rational alternative, I have never heard a discussion of any details of that. So I don't think anyone can answer that question, or the board. So that's definitely got to be worked out in some kind of implementation plan. And I think we heard somebody else has had examples of that done with where they were going to share how that was working. So that would be welcome. But I can tell you that no, I've never sat through a discussion of a computation.
I wasn't trying to be argumentative. I think you misunderstood what I was saying. I have dealt with a lot of real estate, and I was just trying to figure out, sometimes you get two appraisers, one from the person buying and one from selling, and then you look at, okay, that's all I was trying to find out, okay? I wasn't trying to put anybody on the spot or anything, but thank you. I appreciate it.
I wanted to mention one other thing on that. Right now, it's set up as the way Jeff described it, but the way it actually will work, we're not even sure. It's going to be the board doing that, and I think it was mentioned up at the PAC and TAC. Somebody up here mentioned it also when they described it. The goal would be, and I know it doesn't help. It doesn't help the situation, except for land versus water. The goal is to try and voluntarily negotiate a way to stop the water pumping. That's the goal. It's not necessarily take the land. The intent, the mechanism is potentially that, but that's not the intent. The intent is to figure out a way to reduce the pumping through a negotiated process. Oh, okay. That's what it is.
Well, because the paragraph.
I know it says land.
Yeah, the paragraph says you give up the land and all uses.
We really don't want the land.
Okay.
That was an error. Yeah. I mentioned that too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's what I want to make sure.
Hi, Anita M. Sand, Meadowbrook Dairy. So a couple PAC meetings ago, I had some questions, and Jeff gave us some answers, which is on the recording. So the question is we know Lynn Rickard. He's acquaintance of ours, and he was paid by the GA to do $2,000 to do a appraisal on our property. So I would like to know what the GA's appraisal on Meadowbrook's property is. Second, I would like to repeat what Jeff had said a couple meetings ago. He had said that the plan that we are looking at is a plan where they're going to move their pumping up to North Brown Road. They're going to move their pumping to Meadowbrook Dairy. They're going to use Meadowbrook Dairy's wells, and then they're going to put in infrastructure and pipe it down to the town. Now, we had asked very early on that we would like to see, before all of this started, we thought it would be a great idea to do management areas, because we know Meadowbrook Dairy is in the sweet spot. Meadowbrook Dairy is where all the water is. And so I would like those questions answered, and I realize that you probably can't give them to me today, but I'm kind of offended that all of you here are laughing and saying how great Heather did, but you're not looking around and seeing that you are taking family farms. Our farm is 101 years old. We have 5 generations. My little granddaughter goes out on a tractor with Poppy. And you guys are all sitting there taking this very lightly. And I am offended with the numbers we are using. The numbers, hey, I think the only geologist that is doing new data and new numbers is my hydrogeologist, Eddie Teasdale. All of you other guys are doing documents that you are cherry picking what you would like. And I'm sorry, I'm upset, but you're putting my business out, mine and Eddie's business out. And you're taking it all very lightly. And there's people in this room that know what the real numbers are, because we've just discussed these numbers at groundwater at our other meetings before we had this meeting. So I'm sorry about the passion, but this is offensive.
I just want to clarify one thing. I didn't say that the model, when we modeled pumping, moving pumping, we did use what was in the model already, the node that's at Meadowbrook, to simulate moving pumping from the southwest to the northwest. but the intent was not that the water district would take over Meadowbrook's wells. It was simply representative moving pumping from one area to the other, and we already had a node created, so we used it for modeling purposes. And the plan itself says that new wells would be drilled and a new pipeline would have to be constructed to get to them.
Larry Mead. I wasn't going to say anything, but in early 1990s, Stetson Engineering and Mr. Markman was up here, and we tried to settle this then. All this has been done is kick this can down the road to cost everybody a lot of time and a lot of money. And it's absolutely, I agree with Anita, this is ridiculous. You want to say something, Jim? You remember those days? You were up here?
You want me to disagree with you?
No, I was, normally you would.
Well, yeah, normally I would, you're correct.
Any other public comment?
You only talk back to a woman.
Does this work? I've got Derek Hoffman, attorney for Meadowbrook, and I've got a few questions, and I thought it might be easier if I use the microphone so we don't have to jump up back and forth too many times using that one microphone. So I had a few questions, and I too am just still reviewing the plan, so forgive me if some of these questions are already addressed in the draft. But as I've reviewed it so far, my first question is, with respect to the allocation ordinance process that's described in the plan, where a hearing will be held and data will be produced, my question is, who specifically will be the arbiter evaluating the claims and recommending allocations? And will it include the same person who drafted the allocation chart from October that indicated that the Navy could claim the entire native yield and leave no water for anybody else? It's kind of a two-part question.
Okay, for the first one, Derek, I don't think it's been set yet, but the discussion, at least, I just tell you what the discussion has been, is that there will be an opportunity to provide information in public and in writing on pumping. It would be brought to potentially the water resources manager at that time, who would then write a report communicating with the people who submitted the information, and whatever other information they could get would write a document and then turn it over to the authority, review it back with the person who submitted the data, and then it would go back to a public hearing. So there would be a process, but it would likely be a report prepared by a representative of the authority.
But you'd be making a recommendation to the authority, correct? Assuming you're the water resources manager.
It would be an evaluation and probably some conclusions. I'm not sure necessarily a recommendation what they do with it.
So anyone else in addition to the water resources manager that would be part of that evaluation?
Certainly legal counsel.
Okay, and so when you say legal counsel, does that include the attorney, whoever that person was, that drafted the allocation chart last month?
I don't know. You're getting above my pay grade.
Okay.
So.
I don't think I have an answer to the question, but
I'll answer the question.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
The board will make a decision. It's going to get engineering, hydrologic input, and legal input, possibly in closed session, since we've had about 10 threats of litigation over all these water rights issues, and then the board will make a decision.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. Thank you, Jim. My second question is, or I guess my next question is, how will the GSA member agencies that produce groundwater participate in that process? There are several member agencies on the GSA that produce some groundwater, and I'm asking, how will they go through that same prove-up process?
All pumping would go through the same process.
Including the member agencies?
All pumping.
Okay.
All pumping would have a report prepared, yes.
Okay.
That was it. As far as I understand, again, I'm not the decision maker, so
I understand.
I'm just telling you what I understand the process would be.
I understand that too, and I appreciate. Okay. I'm just asking questions that are not obvious on the draft or GSP. Sure. My next question is the pool, the 51,000 acre feet. I'm curious where that number came from. I think Jeff might have mentioned that it came from the allocation chart, that draft chart from October, but if you look back, there was a footnote there, and it referred to a pool but gave no number. So my question is, where did the 51,000 acre feet figure come from? What's it based upon?
It's the 63,000 that was in scenario 6.2 minus the water that was in that pool for cereals.
So if
from
okay.
the 6.2, and the theory of why cereals is out was why I referenced that allocation chart.
Okay, so irrespective of whether Searles is in or out of that, what is the basis for that figure, whether it's 51 or 63?
Okay, I'll just stand up here, Derek.
Okay.
The basis of that figure is because we have reviewed with the board in closed sessions under threat of litigation many scenarios that talk about how much mining is going to be allowed. As you know, SGMA doesn't require the board to allow 1 acre-foot of mining. So the board's trying to come to some kind of equitable conclusion as to how much water to afford agriculture if it doesn't share in the free production allowance or safe yield. And so that's a decision related to the board's value judgment on how much mining will be allowed, which is not final, and I'm sure will be discussed at all the future public hearings. And something, as you know, we discussed forever and ever for months as to what an appropriate amount of mining would be in this basin. So,
physically, Derek, the 63,000. There were model runs that were done before that had ramp down. Okay, and a suggestion was made that for ag, it didn't make a lot of sense to ramp down ag because they get hurt with less water, and taking part of their property out of production made no sense.
Sure, I recall those discussions.
So those discussions, the idea was rather than ramp it down, total the amount that was going to be ramped down before it got to the zero or whatever the number was, total the amount and pool it, and let the ag people use it the way they use it best. Okay. That was the attempt, to come up with that number. So it's the same number total as the ramp down, it's just quantified into a pool instead.
Okay. The next question is, and I've just got a few more, the fallowing program, it's been mentioned a few times, the $9 million figure. I've heard some discussion about it. I know Jim mentioned that we don't know the exact basis for that figure, but it is a number. It's not 10 million, it's not 8 million, it's not, noticeably, it's not 50 million. Right. And so I'm curious, what is the number based upon? Where did $9 million come from? Even though it's preliminary, where did it come from? Please.
Yep, you use some land appraisal stuff, which we explained that it's not really, it's not appropriate to use land.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. It's a land appraisal value, one value, and I don't know exactly which number it was applied to. One of the records we had on agricultural land, and I don't know what period it was from.
So it's based on some document that was studied and determined. Is that the answer?
Some document that had a reference agricultural acres of agricultural land in it.
Okay.
One of the things to try to help on that is I think there may be, and I know this is not easy for you guys to do. I think there may be too much put into that number. I think there's a concern, which I understand, representing ag, and ag's here. I think there's a concern that number means something related to ag folks' property or their water that they might. Right. There's a relationship. I wouldn't put that much into it. It's put into the plan as a placeholder with some documentation. There needs to be a lot more work. We've described what the program would involve, how it would actually work if it happened, and that it would be voluntary. So I think there's too much emphasis on that number and how it might affect you and your clients.
Okay, but I appreciate you noticing that it does jump out.
Yes, that's sure, I do.
Just a couple other questions. I've heard the phrase used commercial ag several times, and I'm wondering what is what is non-commercial ag?
Yeah.
Lorelei.
Well, since the majority of this unincorporated land where we grow ag, except for a little piece in the city, is in the county, commercial agriculture is a agricultural operation on land that's zoned for that, which is A1 or A, which is exclusive ag, where they are farming in order to sell off their product to someone else. Non-commercial ag is when I live on an A1 piece of property with my little house and I grow food for myself. That is defined in the Kern County zoning ordinance.
Is that what's in the GSP? I just haven't seen that yet. I'm curious if that's,
I
that
don't know
distinction is
what
made.
the reference would be for it. Whether I don't know if we distinguish. I don't think there's going to be a distinguish between different kinds of ag on how it's handled.
I use that phrase, and I don't know. There's no definition of that use in the GSP.
Okay.
There's a list of all the agricultural agricultural entities or operations by name, and so my understanding, the small ones and the big ones were selling product. But that's not a defined term. I misuse that term if I confused you.
Thank you. And does the city's growth of alfalfa fall into that category in some way? Doesn't the city irrigate and alfalfa?
I think they do it in a different basin.
Isn't it in the city? So my question is, doesn't the city's use of groundwater for irrigating alfalfa, my question is, how does that fit into this conversation about
it should be treated
agriculture?
The same. It should be treated the same. It's not a municipal use. It's recycled water.
Is it recycled water? Okay.
No, it's not groundwater.
Yeah.
All right, just a couple other questions. And then does the GSP in its current form address new production, new wells, and how that will be managed?
It does not.
All right, I think that's all my questions for today, and of course we'll follow up on with more in writing, but thank you.
Okay, those are good questions.
Any other public comment?
Raymond Kelso. I'd like to say that I'm also one of 5 generations that have lived in this valley. And I do know one thing for sure, this is the desert. And the definition of the desert is less than 10 inches of rain per year when I was in school. In the Restoration Advisory Board committee, which I sit on, I have listened to reports, scientific reports, that say we were drinking anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 year old water. That's old. Any way you look at that, that's old. This is the desert. There is no room for agriculture in the desert. Thank you.
Any other public comment? Okay, with that, let's move to the future dates and really agenda item number 4. And we went over the schedule earlier. There are no confirmed dates of the meetings. From now on, it's based on the assembly date of the GSP for public comment, the evening meeting, the evening workshop, and then the GA meetings themselves. And we shall be standing by in the PAC and TAC as tasked throughout that process to see if we're needed. And subsequent to that, it'll be we'll be discussing, as we were already asked the question at the last GA, about what our subsequent meeting schedules would be once we get the GSP submitted. And I assume, since there are tasks ongoing, we will be continuing to meet. And this is both engineering, technical tasks for the TAC and things related to policy for the PAC. But we haven't decided on, it'll be up to the board when any standing dates or whether they need to be specially called. So we're on call through the rest of this process is what it amounts to. And it just so happens that our next scheduled meeting, Steve mentioned it in passing, we've got the, what is it, Aqua? The water conference is the week of when our next meetings would be. So a good many of all the people, both on the staff and in the committees, would not be present anyway. That's why the week of the 9th is where the workshop will likely be held by the GA on the public draft that is due out the 5th. So with that, any questions or comments on meeting dates? Okay.
I just have a question. What about you said water conference?
It's Aqua.
Association of California Water Agencies. They have.
Oh, okay.
It's out of the area. It's that a lot of their professionals go to the conference.
Oh, okay.
They won't be here for our meetings if we have.
Oh, okay.
Fine.
Okay. All right, we'll move on to item number 5, Water Resource Managers and the committee members' announcements or comments. None. All right, we'll go to the TAC. Are there any members of the TAC that have additional comments they would like to add at this time? Okay, we'll go over to the PAC. Are there any additional comments that members of the PAC have at this time?
My only comment is thanks to Stetson, specifically Steve, Jeff, Heather, in getting this out late. Hope you're feeling better. And to Jim for coming, and to Mojave Pistachios for volunteering and submitting with your bill the funding to cover that. I think this, while not perfect, went better than it could have. So thank you all for your participation. Eddie, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one last comment, and that is we finally got the meat of it going on. You can see the emotions here. But I think if we work together with what limited time we have, and even after the GSP is submitted, we can work this thing out.
Thank you. And I also would like to tell everybody thank you for coming, to all members of the boards, the groups, the public, all your comments. This was greatly appreciated. And at this time, we will go ahead and close the meeting. It is 7:26, excuse me. And we invite all of you to have a good evening.